Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. Thank you for being with us today for this important set of discussions on a pressing topic of how democracies can harness technology to promote inclusive economic growth and development. We know that advances in artificial intelligence and other technologies hold great promise to boost economic prosperity, but they can also worsen economic disparities and even undermine democratic governance. We also know that as these technologies transform business and work, they are shifting growth and distributional dynamics in major ways in both advanced and developing economies. And we also know that their economic and social implications are profound in harnessing the potential for today's technological transformations to build inclusive prosperity. Democratic societies have to answer important questions. How can digital governance advance equity and provide essential services for all? How does technological change contribute to the current rise in inequality in many countries? And what are the implications for public policy? And how can disruptive innovation and the fourth industrial revolution in Africa and the global South accelerate inclusive economic transformation and quality job creation, especially for youth, women, and sustainable development? Now, Brookings scholars have been hard at work addressing these questions as part of the Brookings Global Forum for Democracy and Technology, which is a multi-year effort to address how democratic societies can govern advanced technologies in a way that reinforces liberal norms and values while outcompeting authoritarian models. And one pillar of that effort is technology and inequality, which includes multiple work streams on the questions that I've just highlighted. So I'm delighted that we'll have a chance to share some of that research with you today. And we've assembled 3 separate panels of policymakers, practitioners, and researchers to discuss the complex relationship surrounding democratic societies, technologies, and inequality. And I'm thrilled that Isabel Coleman, Deputy Administrator of USAID, has agreed to join us this afternoon to share her thoughts on these important issues and how her agency is addressing them. We hope you'll share your views too and pose your questions by tweeting with the hashtag #TechForInclusiveGrowth. So with that, thank you again for taking the time to tune in today, and we're very grateful for your interest. Good day.
Hello. John Allen, noting the potential of technology to advance but also undercut inclusive prosperity in democratic societies, sets the frame for today's forum on technology and inequality. I am George Ingram, Senior Fellow with the Brookings Center for Sustainable Development. Welcome to the first of 3 discussion panels. The first one focused on the role of digital identification in advancing inclusion. We are fortunate to have 4 experienced and knowledgeable experts and practitioners in the digital field for this discussion. 2 of them have been instrumental in building digital ID in their countries, representing the quite different country experiences of Estonia and India. 2 individuals are from the US government and civil society who've been at the forefront of building digital capabilities in US assistance programs. Time is short, and we want to get directly to the discussion, so I will forego elaborating on the topic. But I will note that just as COVID has moved to warp speed the central role of digital capabilities, including digital ID, in economic and social life and for government services, so the Russian invasion of Ukraine highlights its role in national security. I will introduce each panelist as I engage each on the first topic, and we will discuss the why and the how of trusted digital IDs. Hans Astuk, a former member of the Estonian Parliament and noted expert on the Information Society, is Executive Director of the Estonian E-Governance Academy, which assists public sector and civil society organizations in low and middle income countries in traversing digital transformation, and I would note is very actively involved in helping the Ukrainian government and society today. To set the stage, Hans, let's focus on the experience in your country. Why was it so important for Estonia following independence from Russia to create a digital ID. 30 years later, what have been the unexpected impacts of digital ID and e-government?
Yeah, thank you very much, George, for this kind introduction. Yes, Estonia started implementation of digital identity almost 30 years ago. And the reason behind it was that as Estonia was like escaping from collapsing Soviet Union in 1991, so actually we didn't have any proper databases about our citizens, property, businesses, land, and anything else. So we started to build it up from the scratches, and we immediately decided that those databases must be digital. But on the top of it, we recognized that that also after a couple of years of development, that as the world is moving very much digital, citizens must have on the top of their traditional paper or plastic-based documents also a digital identity, allowing them securely to use various government services. So in 2002, exactly almost 20 years ago, the digital identity was launched for the Estonian citizen, and it is compulsory for everyone. Actually, it means that you are having it, but you don't need to use it if you don't want. But currently, almost 80% of the adult population already is using it. And it has bring us to a situation that government provided and municipalities provided digital administrative services are broadly available, what means that almost 99% of the services are accessible in digital format, with a couple of exceptions not related to the technology. So we can say that, first of all, the expected results are that services are available for the citizens online, what means that it doesn't mean is it nighttime or daytime when you use the services. It doesn't mean where you are located. You can be in India or US or in Brazil, but you can still access Estonian government services. So it's also reducing burden of physical offices and reducing burden to provide the services in paper manner. Another expected result is that services are much more transparent and faster. So you don't need to wait until you are getting paper certificates. And also the risk of corruption is much more lower, because when it's machine to machine or people to machine communication, there is no points where you can provide bribe if you even want to do it. So as former president of Estonia, Mr. Toomas Ilves used to say that it's very hard to bribe the computer, because you don't know where to whom to provide cash if you even want to do it. But I think the unexpected results, what we can learn now 20 years later, is that the digital identity has changed the nature of a business also. So as Estonian digital identity is accessible for every business also, so you can sign the documents with the same signature what you are using to communicate with the government. So the same digital identity, the same digital signature is understandable and accessible also for the businesses. So every Estonian, when we are logging in to our online bank accounts, we are using digital signature, what is reducing burden from the banks. Or we can sign any contract with any business partner in Estonia with a digital signature, what is reducing a risk of falsification of the documents and speeding up remarkably the business processes. So I think the unexpected result, the fruits we are harvesting now is that business environment is much more transparent, doing business is easier and fast, and this is like an additional result of digital identity in Estonia. Thank you very much.
And did it take long for the Estonian people to adopt to a digital world and to accept their government online? Was it done instantaneously, or was this a 3 or 5 or 7 year slog to introduce the populace to this new technology?
Yeah, I think there was like, it's a usual curve, but initially there are like innovators are going first, when the main bulk of people are coming, and when the last part, what is still like a reluctant or not trusting still very much, or not using still. So it takes like almost, I think, 10 years to get there. But it was at the beginning of 2000. If it start in some country, or some countries start today, when people are much more digitally savvy, but also having gadgets like smartphones in their hands, I think it will take much more faster. But the adaptation definitely is not only about technology, but also related to general trust towards the government. And this has been high during those years in Estonia, what has been supporting the process very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Now over to Dr. Pramod Varma. You really need to know nothing more about Dr. Varma, except that he is the chief architect of Aadhaar, which has provided over 1 billion citizens of India with a digital ID. He created the foundation for India's digital public infrastructure, often known as the India Stack. He has since created other critical layers of digital infrastructure, which we will learn more about today. So Pramod, how would you describe the motivations in India for an electronic ID? Were they similar or different from what Hans has described? And how do you reflect on where India is after Aadhaar was introduced and the rapid digitalization that ensued?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Thank you, George. Yeah, India's journey has been maybe slightly different. We are a developing nation, 1.35 billion plus. I think latest number is 1.4 billion. We really don't know how many people we even have, because the size is really large. 120 actively spoken languages and used languages, 22 official languages, but this diversity is tremendous. Among this diversity and magnitude, one common theme was the natural digitization, underlying digitization, because the cell phones, not the smartphone, pre-smartphone world, the cell phones were penetrating rapidly. People were starting to leverage, and India is very young. You all know India is a very young country. So we are very, most of the bulk of the people are very aspirational young Indians who will adopt anything thrown at them, provided they see value in their daily life, economic growth, job opportunities, work and so on, education and so on. So one of the biggest themes India was chasing was, I think about 18% of our budget, roughly about 2.5% of the GDP at that time, 2009, when we started, was going into direct subsidies into people. So government was like a pre-UBI world, right? We were giving so much money. It was amounting to, I think, 50-60 billion US dollars every year in fertilizer, power subsidies, food subsidies, scholarships, girl scholarships, pregnant women support, and so much of money. There was no clean way to figure out who is actually even getting them, because most people didn't have bank accounts. Most people didn't have identity. So the government was pouring this money, and it was. And one time, in the late 80s and early 90s, people even thought less than 10% actually reaches the poor. And then, but we obviously improved on it, but it was expected that roughly about 40-50% of this money, 50-60 billion US dollars, was going down the drain. And that was not acceptable. So the one very clear mandate was clean up our direct benefits delivery. Benefits delivery must be streamlined so that millions of people and families can get their intended entitlements on time. Second was financial inclusion. Financial inclusion was the holy grail that we were chasing. And pre-2009, the last year, Bureau of International Settlements, BIS, published a report that said we were at less than 20% banking in the country. And that tells you out of 900 million people, adults, only 20% had bank accounts. So that's a terrible situation to be in. So we had both financial inclusion, benefits delivery as the primary drivers for our identity. And then that is one of the reasons India was probably the only country that placed the identity as a developmental effort, not a national security effort. So we did not park the identity program under Home Ministry and subtle things like that, right? Most of the ID program goes into citizenship and Home Ministry, and with our years and centuries of history, citizenship is a debate that will never end in India because the boundaries are all fluid and very tough, right? So it is not for citizens. So we did an identity for residents. So the identity Aadhaar as an identity was, if you are a resident in India, George, if you come there for 6 months and live there, you can actually apply for Aadhaar and you can get one because you can open a bank account, you can do things like that. It's like Social Security in one sense, right? We all had it when we were working here. We were not citizens, right? So similar to that. And we also kept the identity program outside the national security, Home Ministry purview completely into our what's called under Planning Commission, then called the Planning Commission. Now it's called Niti Aayog, which is the strategic developmental planning arm of the government. And now it's an independent authority under the law, identity authority. So these subtle things actually benefited the rollout, acceptability, because we were always after the two what's called killer use cases. If you don't have those use cases, identity would have remained just another plastic card that people barely would know why this was given. They would take it, but they won't use it. They would take anything government gives them free, right? They would take it, but it won't get used. So we were very much into the usage side. We were very clear that benefits transfer has to be transformed. Now, as you know, today, I think 35 billion or 40 billion out of the 60 billion goes directly to the bank accounts of the people today. So we run the largest direct cash transfer program, which came in handy during COVID, by the way. We could transfer 400 million people money instantly, like that, right? And that was powerful. And then we also went from a sub 20% banking inclusion in 2010 to 85% in flat 6 years, which no country would have done that fast. And so these two were very visible socio-economic value that we could give it to the people, and hence the sustainability of identity. Otherwise, the identity would have drifted to a death, I think. George, I hope I answered. Yeah. Are you muted? I can't hear you. You may be, George, you're muted.
There we go. I finally unmuted. So Pramod, how many of those 1.1 or 1.2 billion, I see different numbers, Indians actually utilize their digital ID?
Yeah.
Are there government services that you have to have a digital ID to access? And what do I do if I'm not literate or I don't have access to a computer or a smartphone and can't actually use the digital ID?
Yeah, brilliant questions, by the way. It's one of those things that actually differentiate probably like countries like Estonia. We are not uniform in any way. We are crazily diverse. So we have 300 million people who, at best, who are smartphone enabled, aware, really 100 million people English speaking. But even if you stretch it, 300 million, then about another 300 million maybe with feature phone and who are young, so they can try it out. And then we have at least another 300, 400 million people who have no phones and no literacy background, can't sort of do things their own. So the design of the identity had to be natively digital. So the Aadhaar as an identity is natively digital. So it has no paper manifestation or a chip or a card meaning at all. But it can manifest itself as a printed paper for the people who don't have phone. It can manifest itself using an OTP on a feature phone for the feature phone people. And it can manifest itself as a smartphone, digitally signed QR code on a smartphone, like an Apple Wallet or whatever, right? We have DigiLocker and all that thing. It's like a wallet, credential wallet. For the smartphone people, that's one angle of it. So there is manifestation of the identity, physical manifestation, can vary dynamically. It completely differs. We don't care. So we didn't stick with a card. So form factor was irrelevant to us, and we wanted to make sure any form factor that fits the context is acceptable, while behind the scene, everything digital. Second was that it can be used in a self-service mode, people like us, who can authenticate ourselves, enter the PIN, password, and all that thing, or it can be used as an assisted mode. And India is a huge part of India still leverages assisted services. They go to a officer to get some banking done, right? So somebody will say, okay, put your fingerprint here. Okay, then it'll read out loudly in the native language. Oh, you have withdrawn so much money or whatever, right? These are all assisted services. So we can do assisted self-service or paper through feature phone to smartphone, any form factor. So that answers your last question. The first question was the usage of it. So we have issued 1.32 billion Aadhaars so far. Many of Aadhaar is permanent. It never gets revoked. It is permanent for you for times to come. That number never get reallocated or anything of that sort. We have 1.1 to 1.51 billion digital authentication every month. So that tells you that the usage is quite wide, and we have about 600 million to 700 million unique people out of the adult population. Children don't really do it because typically parents do it for them. Adult population have at least used it once, and at least use it once in a quarter or something like that. So that's very large. One of the things we look at is it a few people using it every day, or is it many people using it on and on? So the spectrum is that very large population uses it, and they use it for pensions, and they use it for financial money transfer and all that other services that identity team didn't build. It was built by the Reserve Bank of India, by the payment industry, and by various government benefits industry, but they use the identity authentication services of the identity platform to build solutions that are either assisted solutions or a self-service solution towards the people. So we have 1 billion every month, 1.1 billion authentication every month. So it's quite wide, quite in play. I think every month gets used very heavily. I hope sort of covered.
Great, thank you. So let's bring Kay and Chris into this conversation. Chris Burns has been leading digital development at USAID for a decade. He managed the joint digital and democracy teams. I would note that it was the digital and democracy experts at USAID that developed the notable USAID 2024 digital strategy, and he currently serves as Chief Digital Officer of the agency. Kay McGowan, as a diplomat and as a development expert, has helped support and build trusted and safe digital financial systems and data sharing systems. She now leads policy, research, and advocacy at the Digital Impact Alliance. And I have to confess, she helped me put together this panel and developed our line of inquiry. So thank you, Kate. So Chris and Kate, first to you, Chris, and then Kate, what are the motivations you've seen driving digital IDs or unexpected consequences in markets where they exist?
Sure, and good afternoon and evening, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this conversation, George. It's certainly an important topic in today's digital age, and what an incredible opportunity for all of us to learn about Estonia's and India's leadership on this front. If we're looking at digital identity infrastructure, USAID's engagement to date has primarily focused on the integration of digital identity in ways that support international development programming, which would make sense. So for example, program monitoring, patient tracking through health services, voter registration and authentication, and the provision of humanitarian assistance. So I would say similar motivations to what Pramod was just outlining. I would say also that digital ID systems are now becoming foundational to service delivery and to development assistance as their pace of rollout continues to accelerate. We see partners and countries both turning to digital ID systems in part where analog systems may sometimes struggle to uniquely distinguish individuals. For example, many people may have the same name or have their name recorded inconsistently across different situations. And so in those cases, it might be difficult to verify their identity. In some cases, individuals might not know their actual birth date, therefore relying on typical information used to verify identification in those analog systems may still result in misidentifying them. So having a digital identity, whether it be a unique number or a biometric, and can in some contexts be a more efficient and transparent way to ensure that verification and to do so accurately. This can certainly be important in some cases more than others. For example, in healthcare in particular, it's obviously really important to make sure that the right patient record is matched with the right person. And USAID has previously done some of that work in part through its Saving Lives at Birth Grand Challenge, where we've supported digital ID in a way to more reliably track new and expecting mothers through the healthcare system and to facilitate the delivery of prenatal care to them. I would say motivation also exists with the high expectation of transparency and accountability in how we deliver our own programs. And in doing so, that transparency can actually spur further investment in the development and delivery and deployment of digital ID systems. I suspect the theme of transparency will come up time and again in this conversation. And certainly it can be a motivation for many institutions, including donors, that want the ability to easily track who receives these services, where the resources are going, and how effectively the resources have been received. We do note that this could lead to repeated investment in digital ID systems, sometimes in parallel to official identity systems. It's not that this redundancy is necessarily unexpected, but it does contribute to fragmented identity ecosystems where the individuals we engage with and for whom we serve might have to enroll in and then keep credentials for multiple official systems, as well as ones that might be introduced at a program or activity level. For the donors and government institutions that often fund digital ID systems, this of course can lead to an inefficient use of resources and possibly a greater burden for individuals and end users as they try to maintain access to those. Certainly in some cases, there might be good reasons for setting up separate systems, particularly if there are privacy or security concerns about an existing system. And for example, we carefully want to consider the realities that are specific to each context. But ultimately, I would note that donors are striving to align our digital investments so that they are more sustainable, more inclusive, and do so in a way that strengthens countries' overall digital ecosystems. Doing so requires us to responsibly integrate with or strengthen the national ID systems in order to drive that longer-term success and sustainability. Over.
Thanks, Chris. And over to you, Kay.
Hey, thanks. George, I just want to say thanks for the invitation, the opportunity, and I'm really happy that Brookings has got this sustained focus on this particular topic of democracy and technology. And you've already told people that I helped you put the panel together, but I was just going to say that I really I'd be hard pressed to find 3 people that have done more collectively and individually than Hannes, Pramod, and Chris to advance the field of how to make technology work for people and how to make sure that it does that without eroding democratic values and institutions. So I guess in response to your question, what other motivations are we seeing? I mean, I think really the clearest answer is we're seeing motivations by countries that have much more authoritarian systems to use IDs and use technology and digital footprints and behaviors of citizens to, manipulate, suppress, repress them. And that's why I think this conversation and having Estonia and India represented is so important, because they've both taken very intentional design choices that look at not just the technology itself, but the technology, the policy framework, and what are the impacts on the marketplace going to be very holistically. And this kind of techno-legal approach is so critical to baking in a lot of those safeguards that we know are needed to prevent the misuse of data. And, I'd love also to hear Hannes talk a little bit about transparency, because one of the most interesting features of the Estonian model and their digital stack is how much transparency citizens have into how their data is being used and accessed by the government. And, for Pramod, I think it'd be so interesting. You talked about some of the unexpected benefits of Aadhaar, but you only started to scratch the surface. I mean, it's far beyond now improving social service delivery, right? You guys have built all sorts of other layers into your digital public infrastructure that work together to empower people, make sure that the benefits of the growing data economy are both larger, but also more broadly shared. And all, in both countries, while being really, really laser focused on protecting privacy and making sure that, online digital participation for citizens is strengthening the country rather than eroding political norms. So I'll stop there.
Well, Kay, you've done a nice job of introducing the next topic of trust.
Yeah,
So thank you. For much of history, identity systems have been used to target and marginalize minority groups. It's quite a sea change to think of IDs as a positive force for change, and it's important to think through how to build trust in them. As I understand it, trust is really central and critical. And I will note that in the US, the IRS was recently forced to stop a shift to requiring digital ID because of political protest driven by lack of trust. So, Pramod, after you answer Kay's question of all of the other 200 things that Aadhaar does, talk to us about how India dealt with the issue of trust in government processing data on individuals and using digital ID. Or have you effectively dealt with the trust issue?
Okay, this is a loaded question. So let me attempt it. So first of all, to be very, very clear, and that was a very conscious choice. Aadhaar does not do 200 other things. Aadhaar does precisely two things. Always have been only doing two things. Even today it does two things. That minimalism of identity layer being extremely minimal. It does really two things. Issue identity, authenticate. When I go to a place that I am Pramod, I can tell the bank that indeed my identity claim is right or wrong. That's all it does. Aadhaar built nothing on top of it. And that's a confusion. A lot of people have it because they think India Stack and every other layer is all connected to Aadhaar. In fact, none of them are connected to Aadhaar. But they are like Lego blocks. They somehow, when you bring them together, the economic value, the individual's value, collective value becomes very high because you have payment now, we have Aadhaar now, we have DigiLocker for credentialing. And when that comes together, the value increases. Aadhaar and the identity authority is restricted from doing precisely two things by law. And it captures 4 attributes. No other identity system in the world captures these 4 attributes. Everybody captures 10 as the best Philippines, and others are like 50 attributes, right, about you, because most of the ID comes from the purpose of marginalization or security, terrorism, those kind of mental model. So the more data is better for identity, in that sense, from a government side. Aadhaar did identity for development. So it's very important. That was part of the trust building as well. So given that clarity, what are the things we built? Essentially, and this is one of those things, I think if Brookings research team has not looked at it, should look at it, because I think some of these are very new and may not be as popular as Aadhaar. And sometimes you get hung up with 2010, what we did, right? What we are doing is in 3 layers. And this is very key. Fundamentally, every citizen or SME, as Hans was saying as well, small companies who are participating in the economy, because we have nano entrepreneurs, right? Big economy, 1-person company, 5-people companies, and millions of them in India, right? They're as good as individuals, frankly speaking. These 2 are at the center, and the 3 things that we want to empower them with is ability for their identity, which we are solving. Business identities and individual identity. Aadhaar was an individual identity. We have business identities as well now for electronic business identity that they can verify. Second layer is assets. Can they take control over their data and their credentials? So data and credential as a empowerment construct, not data is not as a monitoring control construct, as a empowerment construct. India has went all out, and that's what I think Kay was alluding to, that India is one country there. We don't not only have GDPR like law that's coming in as a data protection, we have actually a system that allows individuals to take control over all our financial data, all our health data, without having a central data store. Extremely privacy centric, it's fully decentralized. That means I am the owner of my data. I am the receptacle of the data. Not even government can see my data. So it's very, very clearly constructed architecture, and Kay was thickly in part of that another day's discussion. But so that is second layer. The layer where individuals have control over their assets, whether digital assets, digitized assets, data, and credential, where an SME now can walk into a bank and claim, digitally make a claim that I am a taxpayer, I am an SME, I earn 20,000 rupees or whatever, $100, $200 every month, I pay bills on time, I have a small shop. All these claims are now instantly verifiable by the bank. Why is it important? The cost of trust dramatically comes down from the bank's perspective to say, oh, that's good. I can verify what you are saying, and hence I can now offer micro loans to you. Otherwise, I would have said no to you, because the cost of dealing with you is much more than the business value I'm going to get from the bank. So lending, all that thing is opening up first time, because individuals have identity and assets. The third layer is where the equity, you talked about equity before, right? Economic equity comes from ability to participate in opportunities. So how do we, economic opportunities, that if I'm a gig economy worker, I'm a plumber, I'm a carpenter, today they are taken over by this platform monopolies. The big platforms would say, list yourself in my platform, and my platform will give you business opportunities. Because whether it's Amazon, Uber, they all repeat the same pattern, right? Pattern of a platform model. India is converting from a platform model to a decentralized network model, like internet, where every individual and small company can actually get, sort of broadcast their offers and services on a decentralized network. That's where the real value is. So we are moving towards from an identity, which is essential, foundational, as Chris was saying, to asset ownership, which is necessary to really ability to access economic opportunities in the market. Whether you are a small homestay, whether you are a small plumber, whether you are a small shop, whether you are whatever it is, without having an intermediate platform monopoly taking off 30% of my commission, and it doesn't make any more sense. So India is working deeply in it, and we are actually going like only country in the world that is putting up a decentralized economic network actually in there. Now, this brings back to the last point. I think you were asking, how did you build trust on the identity system? Identity system was because of the minimalism. I think there are a few things we did really well. Keep it outside home ministry. Do not go down to the home ministry security, control structure, rather than ID for development. So keep it as an independent authority, first point. Second, extreme minimalism. That means 4 attributes. All we do is 2 things: legally enforce that they can't do anything more through the act. So we brought in the bill and the bill restricted the authority from doing anything else. That's all they do. But I think it's a mixed bag. Have you solved the trust issue? Frankly, you asked the last question. Is it really solved? No, I think it is an ongoing thing. The fact that there's a bill in authentication tells you that people are leveraging it in their pension and government services, mostly government services, right? Private services have alternate IDs to use it. Banking and government is really they are benefiting. But beyond that, I think there is a mixed bag. You know how India works, right? We love to hate the government and love to love the government. So we are in that sort of situation that we are the largest voting machinery. 700 million, 600 million people stand in line and vote, and do all the democratic processes go through. And we hate the same people who actually we vote. But because they don't do all the good stuff we expect them to do. So it's a mixed bag. And the good thing is that our vibrant democracy, thankfully, is still intact. Hopefully, will continue to be intact. Allowed us to have a very powerful debate about privacy. And that privacy debate around Aadhaar was essential for the country. So the people, the civil society who argued against it, actually people like us always embraced it. We said, that's perfect. That tells you that democracy like India is still not one-sided, right? It is vibrant. Civil society can go to Supreme Court, can argue, can fight it out. And that restricted even further. So identity became very perfect, a pure play identity and nothing more. And the data access was restricted. Mandatory usage was restricted, by the way, George, your earlier question. What was it mandated? It's actually not mandated for anything else other than government subsidies and partially for tax. It's still not fully mandated, but tax collection, because we only have 5% paying tax. So tax collection is a big thing for us. So other than that, nothing else is mandated. So a few things we did, I think, okay.
Thank you, Pramod. That's great. So Hannes, from what I've read, I understand that Kay's discussion of transparency has been important in your country, and Pramod talking about not having a central database. I think that's another element. What are the elements for you all that builds trust? And have you been able to solve the trust issue, or is there still a trust deficit?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think Pramod mostly already explained also Estonian system. So India is like 1,000 times bigger than Estonia, but it looks there is a lot of similarities. Maybe not in population, but on approach at least. So if you're thinking about trust, that's true that the digital identity itself is just a key. We need to consider it is just a key. Access key, very much trusted key. We provided track so everyone can, not everyone, but related parties can track the access, the validity of certificates and validity of identity, let's say. But to build the trust, I think it's about principles. So first of all, it should be agreed in society what kind of data at all collects about you, and what is the reason why the data is collected. So this is kind of fundamental, that if you collect too much information about religion or other approaches, then it's dead end already, when someone can abuse it. And this is like Chinese model, that we need to control everything and provide credentials for citizens being good and accepting those models. This is not our model. So first of all, what you collect. Secondly, it should be clear that ownership of a data belongs to the citizens or businesses who are providing this data to the government. So government is just handling it. Okay, by the law, government may enforce citizens or businesses to provide the data because it's necessary for the functioning of a government and a nation. But anyway, the data belongs either to the citizen or to the business. This is fundamental, and government handles it. So this means that based on this fundamental approach, I can also control what government is doing with my data, how it's handling it. And it's not only theoretical exercise that, yes, I can do it, but actually I cannot access, I don't know what it is. I know. There are tools in Estonia I can I can provide automated requests and get immediate automated response about how government institutions were using my data, my home address, whatever, about my children, and so on. And there should be explanation always on what law, based on what regulations they are using this data. So citizens are having efficient control over the data they are using. But definitely we must consider that not every citizen is that much tech savvy or privacy and data protection savvy that they will do it. So there should be also enforcement in place. So in Estonia also the Data Protection Agency is very strong. They are capable they are enforcing the rules and regulations, and they are actually controlling how the institutions, both government ones, but also private ones, let's say like banks or private doctors, how they are handling your data. Is it kept insecure? Is it access restricted, and so on and so on? So it's also enforced. And definitely every transaction, every use of a data, every digital service must be also based on the law. So it's not only that I have a good idea how to put together data from various databases and identify whatever I can do. No, there should be a clear regulation or legal base for every service. So this means that it's very hard to abuse also the data. So once again, digital identity is a key, but allows only me to access my data, not anyone else. And also it provides a track record, how it was used, and how it can be also later proved that I was the one who was using the data. And fundamental issue, ownership of a data must be in individuals or business hands who is actually providing this data to the government only to handle it. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So Kay and Chris, what advice would you have in terms of ensuring the right safeguards are in place as governments introduce digital ID and accelerate digitalization? Kay?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you were alluding to a really key point that in some ways, the technology itself is the easy part, right? What's harder is making sure that all the wrappers and the safeguards and the enforcement capabilities are present so that these very, very powerful identity systems are not used for any purpose other than which they were intended, right? And it's very interesting how India and Estonia have both taken somewhat different, but also, same spirit of approach in both the design and the governance. And I'll stop there. I guess my one piece of advice is that what democracies and open societies have to think about is beyond the technology and the technical capacity is really the data governance, right? Who has a right to access data, for what purpose? How are those safeguards built into the different elements of the technology and the legal and regulatory frameworks around them? But I think that's really my final bit of advice, that data governance is just as important as the actual technology platform itself.
Great, thanks, Kay. Chris?
Right, George, I would certainly agree with Kay on those key points. I also think it's worth overemphasizing, and perhaps it's not even possible to overemphasize that trust is the critical piece to successful digital identity system development and deployment. And I think, if you look at the Kenya scenario, when they first released, the government released Huduma Namba, their digital ID system in 2009, they have great registration numbers, in part because it was compulsory, but Kenyans initially pushed back because the system came before the necessary privacy protection laws were put into effect. And so that sequencing actually, I think, jeopardizes the level of trust that is needed to make these systems flourish and make them successful. Across all of our digital identity engagements, we take seriously the responsibility of working to ensure identity systems are inclusive, that they are secure, privacy preserving, rights respecting, and where possible, they strengthen the underlying ecosystem components to support those similar values. And while we consider these appropriate safeguards, we also think about how the enrollment and use of the digital identity systems will affect the most vulnerable. If enrolling in a digital ID system is a requirement for an essential service and basic needs, or for service delivery, people will not realistically be able to opt out of sharing their identity information. But while gaining informed consent is certainly necessary and important, we also need to make sure that those systems put additional safeguards in place that go beyond consent. This includes the need to practice privacy-preserving approaches, such as building systems with privacy by design, encouraging data minimization, which has already come up, and having a plan for when the low likelihood but high consequence events, like perhaps a sudden regime change, may occur and risk the misuse of that identity information. And for those who still have concerns, we need to make sure that there are viable alternative methods to verify identity when it is required to access those essential services. Just this week, Research ICT Africa and the Center for Internet and Society shared their research from African digital identity systems, and the researchers made a number of recommendations to improve the inclusion of local and often excluded stakeholders in the design of those systems, as well as ways to improve implementation of them, such as supporting gender-sensitive policies and removing barriers to registration, and really understanding the cultural, political, and economic dynamics of those systems at a local community level. As Kay previously mentioned, with digital authoritarianism on the rise, and with that greater digital repression and surveillance, I think it's fair to question the motivations of some governments behind the rollout of their digital ID systems, and trying to figure out whether they're doing so for service provision or to track and trace. So that the issue of trust, I think, again, emerges here. Finally, I would say that from our perspective, we advocate for taking an ecosystem approach to digital identity systems, recognizing that they interact with and are shaped by many other aspects of the country context. And that's certainly front and center in USAID's digital strategy that you mentioned up front, George, and its accompanying digital ecosystem framework that illustrates digital systems existing in broader environments that include everything from the infrastructure that supports it, to geopolitical considerations and digital rights, and to opportunities to connect within and across the digital economy. So I think this means that we need to support attention to and investment in, among a number of things: cybersecurity capacity, data protection policy, digital literacy, and finally, the role of civil society in shaping and designing those ID systems. In doing so, I think we can ensure that we are hearing the voices of those that are likely to be possible targets of discrimination or unwanted attention, and frankly, the voices of those to whom privacy may matter most. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. So in addition to trust and transparency, privacy keeps coming up. And I wanted to go into some detail in privacy, except we have 5 minutes left. So we've got 1 minute apiece. And Hannes, you've mentioned privacy already. I'm actually going to ask you to spend 10 seconds on that you want to add to, but given the flag behind you and what Ukraine's on everybody's mind, 2 million refugees plus actually almost 3 million outside of Ukraine now, can they carry their digital ID with them, or can they get one? Can a refugee get a digital ID?
Yes, thank you very much. Really important question in current days. I think, first of all, Ukraine has developed a digital identity already connected to their smartphone. So as a next layer. So basically, they already can activate it and carry it with in the smartphone. So this is very important, also related what Pramod earlier said, that actually a plastic card is already out of date. So it's you need a reader and all this stuff around it. So it's better to have it in smartphone. And we have in Estonia already our version, definitely also in smartphone. So they can still carry Ukrainian digital identity with them. But also it's important when now, let's say when they are coming to Estonia and there is like 20,000 refugees already arrived. So what we do, we provide them immediately Estonian identity number. and also Estonian digital identity. So allowing them immediately to start being, first of all, being included to all Estonian systems, because whatever you do in Estonia, either with government or private companies, you need to have ID number, what identifies you, and it's providing you access to all services and all doctors and schools and whatever. They all see you immediately after you're getting this number. And also they are getting digital identity immediately, what means that they can start to use also digital Estonian services in digital manner. So this is very important, and definitely the next question could be that if they are now in Estonia, can Estonia also access to their data? Let's say if they are visiting a doctor in Estonia, can Estonian doctor see his or her medical records of this Ukrainian refugee also, not to start from the scratches, but rather provide the medical service as soon as possible and as rapidly as possible. But this is still not the case, but hopefully it might be solved also, maybe not with this crisis, but with further developments. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hannes. And Pramod, I know it's unfair to ask you to stick to 1 minute, but I am. In India, you went ahead and developed the digital ID, as I understand it, before you got the privacy right. And how did that work, and what are the ramifications of it?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things, right? We did the project, and the project, even the Aadhaar law, called Aadhaar, the act that defines the identity's purpose and what they can do and what they cannot do, and who can access the data, and all that question itself came in, literally 5 years into the project. So not the preferred order, I would presume. But I think the project was under Parliament approved, under the executive order, went to, all the budgetary, everything is Parliament approved and so on. So there was a consensus and discussions about the project. So it was a project, but the authority was not governed under the law until the Aadhaar Identity Act came, Identity Law came, and then subsequently the privacy. So I think the privacy debate happened, itself because of the Aadhaar project was going full swing, and civil society sort of went up in arms and said we really need to debate about the privacy and the access to data. So that's what it triggered. Yeah, but it would have ideally we should have had a privacy bill, and we should have had even the identity bill in that sense earlier. But I suppose that's what happened in India. It did not. I frankly speaking, I don't think it reduced the trust or the acceptance because the need was so high that I was telling you, less than 20% banking, 50 billion out of half the money, or 50 billion going down the drain. People are not receiving money, and so people wanted it to be solved. So I think the demand was very high that allowed us to continue with the project. But the identity bill was very essential, and subsequently privacy debate. In one sense, optimistically, maybe Aadhaar is the reason why even we had that debate. Maybe if we didn't have Aadhaar, India we would have sat on it even more. So we don't know. Okay, so and the one thing I want to leave it on the table, and this goes back to Hans' question as well, point, the design of the privacy. This is one of the reasons why the Aadhaar design team, took extra conscious to make sure 4 attributes is all we capture, and we make sure the authentication trail, there's no track and trace. We talked about track and trace, right? I think Chris was mentioning about that. The system, identity system, cannot track anything because purpose was explicitly not captured. So the identity system is what's called a zero knowledge. It doesn't know why you're authenticating. It doesn't know whether you are in the bank or opening a bank account, or whether you are actually availing food subsidy. The identity system is unaware of it. So it did not capture purpose. It did not capture location. And so we made sure we can only capture extremely minimal things that you said, I am Pramod Verma, and put my biometric, and we say yes or no. We don't want to know why you are asking. We did not want why, where, nothing was captured. And with the law, authority had to delete all the authentication records within 6 months. So that means system has no idea really about your history of usage. And so such restriction was designed in early, because the law wasn't there. So I think it benefited, I think, at the end.
Thank you, Pramod.
Yeah.
Well, Chris and Kay, the best I can do for our audience is to give them a teaser that, Chris, I really wanted to get in with you the guardrails that are needed and the work that you're doing with other donors to create a charter, a digital charter. And Kay, I really wanted you to do the impossible and in 1 minute explain the role of digital public goods, which if you could have done it, no one else has been able to. But if anybody can, you. But maybe we have another panel on those issues. My thanks to all four of you for a superb discussion. I think we're a little bit savvier now. Hannes and Pramod, if you've got time, I'm going to talk to Chris about some reverse foreign aid and see if you could come to America and introduce digital ID for us. Our job will be obviously to create the political trust. Not sure I'm going to take that on, but anyway, thank you so much for being with us. And now we move to our next panel, and I hand off to my colleague Zia, who's a visiting fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program here at Brookings. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, George. That was a very good discussion. So we now move to the next session. I'm Zia Qureshi, a visiting fellow in the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. And I have the pleasure of moderating this session. The topic of this session is technology, inequality, and public policy, which is the topic of one of the research work streams in Brookings Global Forum on Democracy and Technology project, under whose auspices this symposium is being held. Technological change led by digital technologies and the now unfolding innovations in artificial intelligence is a defining feature of our time. The new technologies are reshaping economies and societies. Advances in digital technologies hold great potential to boost economic prosperity. But they also pose challenges. As the new technologies reshape markets and economies, the disruptions they entail can increase economic inequality and in turn foment social discontent and political conflict. Indeed, inequality has risen in many countries, and the rising inequality has emerged as an important subject of political debate and as a major public policy concern. We face important questions. In what ways is technological change contributing to the current rise in inequality? How can the promise of the digital age be harnessed to promote more inclusive growth and development? And what are the implications for public policy? We have with us today an excellent panel to address these questions from the perspective of both advanced economies and developing economies. We have Francois Bourguignon. He's Emeritus Professor of Economics at the Paris School of Economics, a noted scholar on the subject of inequality, and also a former chief economist of the World Bank. We have Nora Lustig. She is Professor of Latin American Economics and Director of the Commitment to Equity Institute at Tulane University, and also a non-resident senior fellow here at Brookings. And we have Deepak Mishra. He is Director and Chief Executive of a prominent think tank in India, the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, or ICRIR, as it is commonly known. Among other issues, ICRIR is engaged currently in research on various dimensions of digital transformation. The event page at the Brookings website provides links to the very impressive resumes of our esteemed panelists. So thank you, Francois, Nora, and Deepak for joining us today, and especially as some of you are joining us at a late hour at your location. I would also like to thank all those who are tuning into this discussion. And as a reminder, viewers can submit questions during the discussion via email at events@brookings.edu or via Twitter at hashtag Tech for Inclusive Growth. So in this session, we will proceed as follows. We will have 2 rounds of questions to the panelists, where I will ask panelists to share their thoughts on first, the links between technological change and rising inequality. And second, how public policy needs to respond. Panelists are requested to keep the replies to 4 to 5 minutes per question. And that will allow us some time to then take up questions received from viewers. So let me start with Francois Bourguignon, with the advanced economies. Inequality has risen in many advanced economies, particularly in the United States, since the 1980s. As the digital revolution increasingly transformed production processes and the nature of work. So is technological change an important contributor to the rising inequality in these economies? And in what ways are new technologies contributing to a higher inequality? In a paper, in a book recently published by Brookings entitled Shifting Paradigms, you say, Francois, that inequality could continue to rise as artificial intelligence leads a new wave of digitalization and automation, what you term an incoming technological tsunami. So how do you see the nexus between technological change and rising inequality? Francois.
Thank you very much, Zia, and thank you very much for the invitation to this very interesting panel. To answer your question first, I think you're right in saying that it is particularly in the US that we see rising trend in inequality. And this is particularly in the US that there is this view that maybe this rising trend is linked to the evolution of technological change. In other advanced countries, we don't see really a trend. We have seen in the past some one-off increase in inequality, but then, for example, over the last 10, 12 years, the inequality trend has been quite horizontal. And nevertheless, there is no reason to believe that over the last 12 years, technological progress has slowed down. If anything, it would be exactly the opposite. So because of that, I think that we should be careful in not associating systematically rising inequality at any moment and everywhere and technological change. Now, as far as the relationship between technological change and inequality is concerned, we're in front of a kind of paradox. In this paper that you mentioned, I was referring to a tsunami of technological change, basically because I was following what futurologists are telling us. And they are competing really in trying to find the highest proportion of jobs which will disappear, of jobs which will be replaced by machine, by artificial intelligence. and new jobs being created that will require a huge skill by the people who will get them. So because of that, we would expect a priori inequality to go up. But now when we look at what happened in advanced countries over the last 20 to 30 years, and technological change, automation, artificial intelligence have been going on for quite a while and at a rapid speed over time. The evidence that we found, which would link technological change and inequality, is much more fragile. At the micro level, very micro level, there are a few studies which have tried to figure out what could have been the impact of robotization on employment, on inequality. They found that, yes, there was some impact on inequality, but it was not that big. And they found that the impact on employment was not that big either. So the kind of a big effect that we would expect was not there. When we look at the evolution of the inequality of earnings in the advanced countries, again, we see a big difference between the US and other countries. In the US, without any doubt, high-skilled people got a salary increase, which was much faster than in the rest of the population. And in other countries, over the last maybe 15 years, 20 years, this is rather flat. Even a country like Germany, where we know that Germans were really trying to attract as many Indians, specialists in computer science, meaning that there was a scarcity of that kind of job, of the kind of expert in the country. Even there is an increase in the inequality of earnings, but it is not that big. So because of that, it is a bit difficult to say that if technological change is so powerful in generating inequality change, then we should have seen already an impact in all countries. So the only explanation that we can give to that is the old Tim Bergen's story about the race between technology and education. When we look at the evolution of the number of people going to college, getting out of universities, etc., we find that it is certainly the case that in Europe, in Japan, there has been an increase in the supply of highly educated workers, much more than in the US. So one possibility would be simply to say, fine, there has been a technological change, but the supply side of the labor market provided exactly the kind of expertise that was needed by the demand side, very much affected by technological change. So this, I think, would be the kind of story that we could tell today. Say, okay, if for one reason or another, technological change is accelerating, then inequality may be rising in those countries where until now it was more or less stable. And if education is for some reason going down or slowing down, then again, we see inequality rising. So this is the race, I believe, is still a good story to explain what has been going on. And let me add only one final point, which is the fact that we expect, following the futurologists, that if there is this big change toward automation, toward robots, toward artificial intelligence, then we expect that the owners of the algorithm, the owners of the robots will see their share of national income going up. And therefore, we should find that the share of capital income in GDP should be going up. This is something that we observe in most countries over the very long run, but there is some debate about what is behind that. Some people say that what is behind that is essentially the increase in real estate prices. So difficult, or real estate services. So it's difficult to say. But Certainly, this is something that has to be watched very carefully, because this might be one of the main reasons why inequality could go up if the tsunami, as a matter of fact, is coming.
Yeah, thank you, Francois. We will come back to some of the issues you raised. So let's turn to developing economies. Deepak, while digital transformation has been increasing inequality in some advanced economies, particularly as Francois just noted in the United States, by polarizing job markets, widening earnings inequality, and also the increasing market dominance of large digitally advanced firms and digital platforms. Will this transformation have similar impacts as it penetrates developing economies? And also, developing economies' comparative advantage based on low-skill, low-wage labor may get increasingly eroded by advancing automation. So the question is, will the new technologies produce rising inequality and diminished job prospects for these economies, rapidly growing low-skill working age populations? Inequality in India has been rising. So how do you see the technology inequality dynamics playing out in an economy such as India's? Deepak?
Thank you, Jia. Good afternoon, good evening, good night, depending on where you are. If I sound a bit groggy or sleepy or incoherent, you blame it on the time. It's midnight in Delhi, but I'm super excited to be part of this panel. So before I start answering your question, I just wanted to say something based on what Francois just said. You know, there are three views, potential views when it comes to technology and inequality. So kind of the Mark Anderson, who is the Netscape founder, he tweeted after we finished the WDR and published it, he says, technology is not driving inequality, full stop. So that's the kind of the Silicon Valley where that, you know, don't even think about it, that technology is driving inequality. That's, I think, too optimistic view on this. I think the more pessimistic on the other extreme is that technology is the kind of the one of the main factors driving inequality, and we can't do anything about it. It's like a fait accompli. I think there's a third view, which is the kind of the middle range, which is that technology is subtly driving inequality to some extent. There are good evidence to believe in it. And it's not a bad thing, because technology is inherently unequal. They are productivity biased, they are skills biased, and they are power biased. So firms which are more productive tend to use technology better, and workers who are more skills tend to use technology better, and so are the powerful, you know, individuals or government agencies can use it much better than the ones who are less powerful. But that's the whole reason why we have public policy to deal with those side effects of technology. So in a sense, I fall into the second camp of where I do believe that technology does lead to contribute to inequality, and that's very much inherent in the way the whole technology and growth functions. And that's something that we don't need to fight it directly by saying, let's not bring in those technologies, but try to fight it by using social and fiscal transfer that we have. Now, let me turn very quickly to the India discussion. So I think there are three parts here to your question. One is, what has really happened to technology adoption and distribution of that adoption in India? Second part is, what has happened to inequality that you said has obviously increased. And third is, is technology driving those increased inequality in Indian context? So first is on terms of adoption and the distribution of this technology over the last few years. So India being a big country, a lot of the numbers are huge, but it does, give you in perspective as to how massive this transformation is happening in the Indian context. So at this moment, there are about 1.3 billion Indians who have digital ID, which is huge. Among, there are 1.2 billion mobile subscribers in India. There are about 900 million internet users. There are about 600 million who are using internet on a regular basis. And there are about 500 million people who have bank accounts, and disproportion of them had a bank account because they had a digital ID and a mobile phone, because a lot of the bankings are now moving digital. And COVID has been an accelerator to this adoption. To give you an example, in 2017, only 20% of Indians are users of internet on a regular basis. This number has become 50% by 2021. So almost 2.5 times increase, but there's still half of the Indian population who are not regular users of internet on a day-to-day basis. We did a survey recently where we found that micro, small, and medium enterprises in India are actually increasingly adopting technologies. So in 2021, of the firms that we surveyed, 27% of the sale came through e-commerce, and the number in 2020 was 12%. So you can see how dramatically this numbers is changing over time. And as we heard from the previous speaker about this whole digital ID and public digital platforms from India, that there's been an explosion of digital platforms. It started with the digital ID, which became the base, on top of which there are now unified payment system. There are the whole COVID vaccination platform was built around it, which kind of made it very easy for Indians to actually vaccinate, irrespective of where you live and where you are. So all those things are obviously super important in showing that the acceleration has dramatically changed over time. But then what has happened to the distribution of those? So while the mean has increased, what we find also the distribution has widened. So there is a lot more inequality in the way the access has happened. So the poorer Indian states have actually had a slower growth of internet adoption than the richer Indian states. When it comes to, we had a survey that we did with Learn Asia with 7,000 users, where we found that 89% of households who have the head of the household has a tertiary education. Of that, so households with tertiary education, 90% have internet access. Households with no education, if the head of the household, has only 10% internet access. So there's a 10:1 difference in terms of the head of the education. When it comes to age, 15 to 25 years, 71% of them use internet. If you're ever 55, 12%. So there is massive distribution gap in terms of education, age, and income inequality. Thankfully, the gender and geographical inequality is lower. It's still very significant, but much less than income, age, and education. And the gender and rural urban gaps are actually shrinking over time. So there is some positive news on that. But so while access has improved, the distribution is widened. And then the question is, what are people doing with this technology that they're using, having access to? And here we find that actually during COVID period, even households which had access to technology were not using it, providing remote access to their children's education. So in a sense, despite access, even among the rich households, a lot of them are not effectively using it as it was perhaps done in many advanced economies. And that's something that I'll perhaps come in a later part of the discussion as to why are people, despite having better access, are not able to use it. Then coming to the inequality, as you said, inequalities increase. And the question is, what has technology to do with it? And frankly, the evidence at this point is not enough to take a very clear stand and a credible stand on this issue. But what you find is clearly technology in India at this point, given the low adoption rate that was there, so with increased adoption, the technology is creating more growth, creating more jobs. There are not massive automation in India. So this whole polarization and job displacement hasn't yet started in India. I think it's down. And clearly there's been a significant improvement in service delivery. So a lot of positive story, but as I said, because the distribution is widened and because the rich, people with access to technology and at the top end have seen massive increase in the wealth, which may not be anything to do with technology, but because of a whole host of other reasons, quantitative easing and liquidity in the global market, you do see significant increase in inequality over the same period. So there is a strong association, but I think causality would still needs more research to be said in clear terms. I'll stop here, Azia. Thank you.
Thank you, Deepak. Some very interesting numbers, and I think India is a very interesting case to see how these technology inequality dynamics evolve as there is a greater technological penetration in the economy going forward. For the next question, we stay with developing economies, but move to a different region, Latin America, where Nora has a lot of expertise. So how technology impacts inequality depends greatly on how its effects work through the labor market. Whether it leads to higher inequality is influenced greatly by how the supply of skills responds to the changing demand for skills, or what has been termed the race between technology and education. Francois referred to that. In Latin America, unlike in other regions, unlike many other countries, inequality, in fact, declined in several Latin American countries, albeit from high levels, in the 10 to 15-year period starting around 2000. So Nora, my question is, how do you explain that outcome? Did a public policy push to expand education give education the upper hand in this race with technology? And briefly, what are the trends in inequality in the region since that period of decline in inequality? Nora? Nora, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, yes. Good, thanks.
Yes, thank you, Zia, for inviting me to be in this distinguished panel, and thank you to Brookings. Yes, so I think that my intervention is going to connect very quickly with what Francois was saying. First of all, because Latin America was is a region that experienced a unique episode, historically actually, of persistent inequality decline for about a decade, that not only occurred in a few countries, it practically occurred in every single country, in different degrees, but every single country of the region experienced a decline in any of the measures of earnings inequality, in particular when you look at it, between around 2000, some of them started earlier, some a little later, and sort of this trend stopped around 2012, 2013. I'm going to come back to this later. So the question is, what was behind this? The period in which inequality declined in Latin America coincided with the commodity boom. And so many of the countries are commodity exporters. So people, first of all, thought maybe it was related to growth, more fiscal space, higher demand for low skill intensive sectors. And it also coincided with a pervasive governments of the left being in the executive in Latin America. At some point, about 10 countries of the 17 were governed by a leftist or leftist-leaning government. But it turns out that inequality declined both in commodity exporters and commodity importers, countries that were growing fast, countries that were not growing, and countries that were governed by the left, and countries that were not governed by the left. So there has to be a different explanation. And I think that the explanation is going to go in the direction that Francois already hinted from the research that we have done. By the way, one of the first books that looked into this was published by Brookings with my co-author, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva. We edited a volume called Declining Inequality in Latin America. And we put a decade of progress with a question mark because it was sort of like the beginning of a pattern and we were not entirely sure whether what we saw was something that could actually say it's happening. It did happen. And what we found is that the wage gap between people with higher levels of education and people with lower levels of education narrowed during this period. And this was the reverse of what had happened in the previous period, where in the 90s, inequality rose in many countries and it was associated with an increasing wage gap. But then, the question is, relative wages are determined by demand and supply forces. What we saw systematically is that there had been an expansion of education, primarily completing primary education and completing secondary education was expanded significantly in the 90s. And this contrasted very sharply with what had happened in the 1980s. In the 1980s, there was a lost decade, the debt crisis, educational upgrading was much slower. And so the rising inequality in the 90s might have been linked to a process also of a change in the supply of skills, accompanied also by a change maybe in the demand of skills. Some of the research has hinted or has shown or suggested that the demand for skills increased in the 1990s, both because of changing technology and also because of the opening up of the economies. We think that then the explanation is primarily one in which the composition of the supply of labor changed, making people with higher skills, where skills are now measured with years of education, relatively more abundant. And that resulted in the declining wage gap, and that was the major driver of the decline in inequality. So this is a very nice story because it means that through a public policy where governments can actually take action and obtain a win-win, because educational expansion has many other benefits in addition to the decline in inequality, you could actually see a result in the right direction for the region. However, we anticipated this in the book, by the way, the access to primary and even secondary education is relatively easier for all the countries than access to tertiary. So we anticipated that this sort of boost to expansion was probably come to a would peter out, because the quality of education in Latin America is still pretty bad. And access to tertiary education, even if it's not a problem of financing for people that do not have the basic education at the necessary quality, would not be an option. And that I think also what we're seeing since the 2012 and 2013 is a petering out of this process. By the way, we're starting a new project with the same co-author and others to look at the question 10 years later. Is it a reversal of this? We sort of start from a hypothesis probably that the race between education and technology after 2012 went the other way. And you do see not necessarily a sharp increase in countries, but you do see that inequality declines started to not happen. And in some countries, inequality started to rise. Of course, you have the pandemic in between, and we'll talk about this later.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Sure.
This brings in a sort of a wild card in all this analysis, but it's connected with the idea of how the pandemic is affecting the race between education and technology and how it's going to affect inequality in the future. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Nora. I think this provides a good segue into our second round of questions, and we need to sort of pick up the pace a little bit. And I think in the next round, maybe limit our replies to no more than 3 minutes each. Now, regarding the role of public policy, as I think all of you have said, that rising inequality is not an inevitable consequence of technological change. Much depends on how policies respond. So let me again start with Francois on that. What policy adaptations are needed to produce a more inclusive outcomes from digital transformation? Should tax and transfer policies do more? Should public policy steer technological change toward more inclusive, labor-friendly innovations? So if we look at sort of these three policy domains, let's call the first pre-distribution, the second redistribution, and third, influencing the direction of technological change itself. How do you briefly, broadly see the policy agenda in terms of these elements? Francois?
Yes, since we don't have very much time, let me be very brief on this. I think that the first thing is really that following all what we have said about the diagnosis of inequality and technological change, education is definitely the big policy area. Not only we need to train people better in terms of IT, AI technology, but we may also have to change the curriculum in primary school, because the way in which we were training or educating people was for jobs which will not exist anymore. So we certainly have to think about the reorganization or the reorientation of our educational systems. I would say that this is the priority. Second, to correct increasing inequalities through taxes and the benefits. This is always possible, but note that we need some minimum increase in inequality if we want to have the incentives on the demand side of education for people to indeed go get the kind of training that they need to be competitive on the labor market. So to simply equalize blindly may not be the right strategy. But it is certainly the case that we have instruments like progressive taxation, like different types of benefits that should allow us to reduce any increase in inequality. And because we are talking about the COVID, or because we will be talking about the COVID, we have seen at the time of the COVID how fast it was possible for governments to use those redistributive instruments. And if tomorrow there would be this tsunami I was referring to before, then it is certainly the case that some kind of basic income, basic transfer system would be applied. And the third policy that you mentioned, should we steer the technological change? This was a suggestion made in a paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo. And there's also a suggestion made by the late Tony Atkinson. The point by Acemoglu and Restrepo was to say we should avoid technological change, which is a pure substitution. If there is no increase in total factor productivity associated with this technological innovation, then it should not be adopted. This is fine. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, fantastic. Now, how do you do that? And how does the government can guess what will be the impact of some kind of technological innovation? So I'm not sure that we can go very, very far in that direction. And to some extent, I would prefer the kind of suggestion that Atkinson was making in his book on inequality, What to Do. One of his recommendations was to make sure that in all public services, people would be able to access a human voice rather than to access an algorithm and an artificial or synthetic voice. By saying that, he was basically showing that there would be a kind of voluntary policy to have something which would be labor intensive in some part of economic and social activity. And at the same time, this probably would change social relationship. I think that I would prefer to go in that kind of direction, if necessary, than to the direction of trying to control technological change, which seems to be a bit Promethean.
Yeah. Thank you, Francois. This makes sense. Deepak, a few years ago, you led a report at the World Bank that highlighted the promise of the digital revolution. It spoke of digital dividends, the broader benefits of digital technologies for growth, jobs, and services. So using India as an example, briefly, what policies is India implementing to realize these dividends, and what more needs to be done? Deepak?
Thank you, Zia. I think I'll take much less time because I took a little longer in the first question. So very quickly, I think when we wrote the WDR in 2014-15, that was the 2016 WDR in 2015, I think we were a lot more pessimistic on India when I go back and read it than what I see it now. And I think the big thing that we missed out, we did talk a lot about the digital ID and the benefits, but what we didn't see was the cascading effect in the positive sense that this platform will bring in. We saw the Estonia example, and we had used the Estonia to kind of extrapolate how this is going to play out. Actually, I think Indians have done even better in terms of using the digital ID as a platform for many other services, partly because of a risk, which is that Indians are a lot less concerned about privacy and security at this point, which might be a huge challenge and a stumbling block going forward. So I think in terms of challenges and what Indians needs to be doing, I think first is, I think internet is still inaccessible and unaffordable to a very large part of Indian population. So there's a massive agenda on the connectivity that India needs to do. And a lot of the government programs are not working very well for the rural India, and they really need to think about it. I think the point on skills in education remains valid, even if India is a net exporter of human capital to the rest of the world. I think there's a massive number of Indians who are still not used to basic literacy, digital literacy, and there's a need for that. And for the future generation that are coming into a labor market in 10, 20 years, I think that part has not dealt with. There's an education crisis, learning crisis in India. So I think that's the second point. The third is the one that I mentioned. I think there is the privacy legislations are weak. The awareness is much weaker, and the systems are very fragile for cyber, attack. So all those things needs a much more investment. And the final point is there is a sense of nationalism and localization of the data, like many other countries in China and others, and Indonesia have tried, which is the government would prefer that a lot of the India sensitive data of the citizens stays in the country. India is a tropical climate where building large servers and clouds is expensive. But if you do that, this is going to disrupt a lot of the business model. And the fact that India actually uses the rest of the world data to do business process outsourcing would also be under danger. So I think, to me, the skills of access, affordability, privacy, and nationalism are the kind of the four big challenges that the Indian digital economy faces. And this needs to be tackled if India wants to have a 20% of the GDP coming from the digital economy in the next 5 years, which is the government target. Thank you.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, clearly the role of education and training is important. It has been stressed by all of you, and Nora, you in particular in the context of Latin America. Your recent research expresses some concern that the COVID-19 pandemic may compound the challenges in the region in preparing workers for the work of the future, because the pandemic may increase education gaps. So what's the agenda there? How to prevent such lasting scars from the pandemic? We have a couple of minutes, Nora.
Yes. Yeah, so now casting exercises that we've been doing shows that for children that come from low parental socioeconomic background, the pandemic could put high school completion rates similarly to what they used to be for children born in the 1960s. Okay, so huge retrogression. We're doing the same thing for Africa, by the way, the same analysis, and we're finding similar results. So it's not just a situation that affects Latin America. What this means is that probably in the future, the composition of the labor force will move in the wrong direction from what I said earlier. So what governments could do, I think, let me just be very quick since we don't have time. There's, I think, 3 areas in which action has to be mindful about what may happen in the future. First of all, I think that it's the sort of aggregate fiscal policy. Now the governments might have to rein in the fiscal deficits that were increased during the pandemic. It's very important not to cut education spending in particular, protect areas that are important to proceed with the process of inclusive growth, have to be protected from the fiscal consolidation that's inevitably going to come. The second thing has to do with how to use technology to make sure that education is inclusive. And I think we're not through with the pandemic, unfortunately. And with also, we've learned that there's other reasons why people may have to use remote learning. So all the digitization that we've learned in the past 2 years, and also the things that we learned that did not work should be put to use in order to make it much more pervasive, the access to digital technology. But thirdly, the main reason why we find that children that come from families with low socioeconomic background do much worse than the others is because they don't have the mentoring and the ability to be sort of coached when they do homeschooling, regardless of whether they have access to technology or not. So the remedial actions will have to be very focused on, first of all, rescuing those that have already dropped out to try to bring them back in. And second, to those who are in risk of dropping out of school in order to avoid this becoming a massive lasting scar in the future. That type of initiative is very, if you want, targeted, and it's not something that can only be done at a distance. It's not something that the governments by themselves are going to be able to do. It will require contributions from both the private sector and civil society as well. Let me stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. We are unfortunately out of time. It's a big topic to address in 45 minutes that we had. We don't have time left for taking up any of the questions that we received, but in your remarks, you have already touched on several of the themes in those questions. We live in a time of exciting technological innovations with immense potential and possibilities, but as we just heard, there are also major challenges to manage this change, to build inclusive prosperity. So we thank our panelists for their thoughtful observations. It was a stimulating discussion. And we also, I would like to thank those who joined us online and for the comments that they sent. So we need to wrap up this session now. So we move to the next session. And I would hand over to Priya Vora, our colleague at Brookings, who will moderate the next session. Thank you, Francois, Nora, Deepak, and thank you all to those who joined us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Zia. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Hello and good afternoon to everybody. My name is Priya Vora. I'm a non-resident fellow here at Brookings, and I'm the managing director of the Digital Impact Alliance. I have the pleasure today to moderate a discussion with Isabel Coleman, who I believe is joining us shortly. So if everyone can hold tight as we make sure she's on the line. Thank you. Thanks for your patience, everyone. Just hold tight. I hear we will be joined momentarily by Deputy Administrator Isabel Coleman. So thanks for your patience.
Priya, while we're waiting for Administrator Coleman to come on, why don't we continue the conversation that we had in our panel, and maybe you talk a little bit about what the role of digital public goods is in promoting digital development.
Yeah, well, thanks, George. I mean, I think what Estonia and India have done is paved the way and demonstrated at incredible scale what's possible in terms of having national payments infrastructure and national identity infrastructure. And so the movement of digital public goods is basically suggesting, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's try to use solutions that exist, try to make sure that they are open source or open standard so that other countries, especially those who may not have the great engineering talent that India does, for example, so that they can kind of leapfrog and use some of those same tools, modify them obviously for their context, and hopefully save a lot of time and resources in doing so. Sounds easier said than done, but that's the great promise.
So one of the issues that came up that we didn't have time to pursue, and that is not intuitive, is why not have a central database with everybody's data and information in one database that's easy to access and you've got it all in one place?
Well, the biggest issue is, you want to make sure that, well, how do I do this? You don't want to have too many kind of pipes going into one system. So you might have my information in obviously a database, but what you don't want also closely linked is, my healthcare details, my, my financial details, my movements, all sorts of things about me. So, in both the cases of Estonia and India, there have been concerns about breaches in security, and the more information that's centralized and available at one point about me makes it more concerning if there is some sort of breach. And of course, data security is a complex issue, and we have to prepare for a situation where databases will be hacked into. So not having as much centralized.
So your data, discrete aspects of your data might be spread over 5 or 6 different databases.
Right, exactly. And the complexity there is then you want to make sure that not just your Aadhaar or your ID database is very secure, but everything that then kind of links to it. So there's a real need in all of this to be mindful of cybersecurity, and not just kind of the policy regulatory environment, but the very hard skills of keeping those databases secure.
So it sounds like a government's digital system is quite complex. And, my observation is that national systems tend to be built in pieces over a period of time without a comprehensive plan or strategy. It is important to start out with a comprehensive plan and then build the pieces logically so that they all fit together? Or is that too much of a dream?
Yeah, I kind of think that might be, wishful thinking. In my mind, the need is to have a very specific use case, because you're not trying to design technology and then just hope it's useful. You want to have a use case in mind. But as you're designing the technology, you want to do so in a way that's mindful of other use cases. So, and that the technology is built for reusability and repurpose. And so, there's the term of elegant code. You want to really make sure that the code is elegant, the design is elegant, even though you might be squarely focused on a particular use case.
And the word elegant really means simple?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It can kind of endure many use cases. Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, looks like thank you for filling the time, George. It would have been very awkward for everyone to just stare at me.
Well, you did well, thank you.
And ironic to be having technical issues as we're talking about technology, but so it is, right?
That's why we need to get Hannes and Pramod here to help build our technical systems for us.
Well, thank you so much, George, for keeping me company.
Okay, I look forward to your conversation.
Yeah, likewise.
With Administrator Coleman.
Okay. Well, thank you to everybody in the audience who's waited with us patiently here. I hope we have Deputy Administrator Coleman on the line. I see your name, but not face as yet. If you can hear me, it would be great to make sure that your video is on and you're off mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I'm dialing in. We're having digital problems here.
The irony of it all.
The irony. I really, really apologize.
Well, that's okay. We're just delighted to have you here. And if it's okay, I'll just jump right in, even though we don't have your video live. Is that okay?
Yes, I'm sorry. Yep, I'm on the phone. For some reason, I could not get through on the Zoom link, and I apologize.
That's okay. That's okay. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. So my name is Priya Vora. I'm a non-resident fellow here at Brookings, and I'm Managing Director of Digital Impact Alliance at the United Nations Foundation. I'm so pleased to have you here today and to spend the next, well, let's say 40 minutes or so because you are just one of the most important leaders in foreign policy and foreign assistance. As Deputy Administrator, you're helping lead the largest bilateral agency in the world, and you're overseeing the agency's work to strengthen healthcare systems, combat climate change, counter authoritarian influences, and promote democratic values, just to name a few of your small tasks. So it is really, really a pleasure to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here. And again, I'm so sorry about our technical challenges.
No, that's quite okay. Before we get started, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you and your team for all the work that you do every day. I worked at the agency for 8 years during the Obama administration, and I know how USAID and especially our implementing partners serve as frontline workers in some of the most difficult parts of the world. And of course, sadly, there are many of those right now. So our hearts and thoughts go out to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Deputy Administrator, we are here really to talk about technology and digital tools. They're in the spotlight now more than ever because of the great promise they hold in accelerating progress against the SDGs. And of course, during the time of COVID, we all have to rely on digital tools to stay healthy and productive while we stay remote. But of course, we're also seeing great misuses and abuses of digital technologies. And I won't review those here since there have been a couple of panels preceding us where we've talked about this. And just want to say we have a lot to cover. But I want to start by acknowledging the role you played prior to joining USAID. You were COO of Give Directly, which is, of course, an organization that channels assistance directly into the hands of people who need it most. Give Directly has prompted a spirited debate about how foreign assistance is most effectively rendered. And at a minimum, it's shown how the development community really needs to broaden its toolkit. And Give Directly is, of course, also limited by the availability of payments and identity solutions worldwide, which are critical to making these kinds of seamless transactions. So I thought as a first step, you could just reflect on your time at Give Directly, what you learned there about payments and identity solutions, and how you're bringing those observations into USAID.
Sure. Well, thank you. And again, my sincere apologies for being late and not being with you through Zoom, but just on my phone. And thank you for your kind words. Right now, it seems to be full Ukraine all the time. But when I came into this role, I was really determined not to let the urgent crowd out the important. And right now, of course, there are many urgent crises that we're facing, but digital is really among the important. It is so important that we have a robust, comprehensive digital strategy that we can implement here at USAID to strengthen open, inclusive, and secure digital ecosystems in the countries we partner with. As you'll see in the digital strategy that we launched just about a year ago. And just to put that out as our starting point, to answer your question, it's interesting reflecting back on my time at Give Directly. Of course, Give Directly is unconditional cash transfers, but I also think of it as a tech company, as a financial inclusion effort. So much of the work we did is with the very, very poorest who live really off the grid. They have no identity, let alone a digital identity. One of the first steps we would take is to give people a means of accepting an electronic cash transfer, a phone that would cost, an SMS-based system. It would cost us somewhere between $6 and $9, and it would come out of their cash transfer. And some people had a phone and would choose not to take it, but most people, even if they had a phone, wanted another one at that good price because we would buy it wholesale. And I guess one of the key lessons learned for me is, first of all, how quickly people learn to use a phone like that, and to, even if they're not literate or numerate, to quickly figure out what buttons they need to push to access a cash transfer. And then how creative and self-directed and self-reliant people are in figuring out how to connect an electronic cash transfer to the real economy, to walk some distance, to be able to cash it out at a kiosk, and how quickly the infrastructure would emerge to enable that. We did a program in Liberia, Give Directly did a program in Liberia that people said was impossible to do because it was rural and remote, and how would people be able to cash out their cash transfer? And yet, they did. They figure it out, and before you knew it, word would get around, and pop-up kiosks would emerge, and people would be able to cash out and use the money for whatever they deemed important. So that's a long way of answering your question. I think people are innovative, they are self-directed, they are resilient, and they figure it out pretty quickly if you put the tools and the means in their hands. So maybe I'll just I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, and now that you are at USAID, what do you hope the agency's role will be in promoting payments and ID systems worldwide?
Yeah, well, certainly for many years, USAID has been one of the leaders and drivers of advocating for safe and inclusive policies and regulations in partner countries to enable a robust digital environment. As a founding member of the Better Than Cash Alliance, we've worked for many years with governments and the private sector and international organizations to support the transition from cash to digital payments here at USAID, as a way, of course, of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, it cuts across so many of them. If you can put efficiently, connect people into financial systems and payment systems. And that's included working with ministries of finance, banking authorities, to make sure the right policies are in place, and reaching the underserved in a responsible way. So USAID has been a leader in that for many years. With my role here, I would love to see us accelerate those trends and continue to foster demand for services by enhancing digital literacy skills and making sure that more and more countries have safe and affordable payment systems in place that people can access. So particularly in remote and underserved areas. So that is certainly one of my driving goals here. I've just seen the power of that up front, up close, and certainly, Priya, from your time here, you're well familiar with our Better Than Cash Alliance work that we've driven and the type of work we've done in this space. So driving it forward, but also in a more, as I mentioned, with our digital strategy, in a more comprehensive way, and really focused on digital identity too, making sure that people have the ability to, in all the different ways we're touching people, whether it's through health programs or other, that digital identity that is created is portable and has a broader application than just a narrow one.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that was certainly one of my big findings being at USAID, that, we may not be driving the supply side as much. There's a huge opportunity to aggregate demand for payment services or for rural connectivity solutions. So it was actually a very interesting kind of pivot in that sense. I want to talk about your vast experience in the world of building and observing democracy. 9 years ago, you wrote the words, "Democracy is struggling." Every year since you wrote those words, global internet freedom has declined year over year. And when the public sphere of the internet is under attack, democracy as a whole is under attack. So I wonder what you believe democracies of the world should do to ensure digital tools, the digital economy really uphold the original vision where the internet is broadening access to information and opportunity and giving voice to the voiceless and not undermining liberal democratic values.
Well, that is an absolutely critical question. I think the first step is for democracies to acknowledge that even though technology is being used to promote empowerment, equality, inclusive growth, all of these good things, it's also being used to abuse human rights, promote gender-based violence, the unlawful surveillance and repression of populations. I think it goes beyond what I imagined a decade ago. You see it not only in the really, really bad countries, but you're seeing it in countries that we didn't even think of as so bad before. Just the opportunity to facilitate corruption and undermine the rule of law in so many ways. So I think what we're seeing is the use of technology as a driver of global democratic decline today, even as it's also a source of democratic renewal and resilience. So it's such a double-edged sword. Recognizing that social media platforms and other digital technologies have really given rise to new forms of misuse, and I think starting at that point is really important. And then, taking steps to counter that. You've seen, I think, civil society certainly, and the UN system, the G7, others, waking up to the threat and trying to address the challenge through a variety of different mechanisms. The Biden administration has made this a priority, pledging to, combat online harassment and abuse, both here in the United States and globally, and, looking at other ways to support the digital safe practices as part of our whole democracy renewal efforts. So there is the global partnership that is Denmark-led, that we are very supportive of too, to try to galvanize the multilateral system, specifically responding to gender-based violence, but the whole advancing digital democracy work that was part of our Summit for Democracy, I think is another big step forward in this for us, to really try to tackle this critical issue. Administrator Power last year announced at the Summit that we're planning to provide up to $20 million a year in this effort. But it's complicated. It requires really a whole of society approach that is going to be, I think a relatively heavy lift in some ways to get governments to strengthen their legal and regulatory frameworks for technology and data to align with international human rights norms, to increase investments in technologies that are bolstering human rights, rights-respecting technologies, embedding human rights and democratic values into tech development, design, and deployment, and really getting civil society and the general public to hold governments and companies accountable. I mean, it's really a multi-pronged effort.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely no easy task, and because, as you described, the very same tools that can be used for good can also be used for bad. I wonder, given the fact that USAID operates in such a vast array of countries in sometimes conflict and post-conflict and stable environments, are you thinking about how to kind of nuance your digital strategy or provide guidance for how to invest in digital development in the kind of different environments?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And we see a huge range of different environments, as you've noted. And part of what we're doing is with our digital strategy is starting out by doing almost like a digital audit in the places that we work and figuring out what are the most important touch points and ways that we can be most engaged and most helpful. You know, first of all, just defining a digital ecosystem as the systems, enabling environment, and the stakeholders that make it possible for people and communities to use digital technology to access services and interact with each other, pursue economic opportunities. But needing to like really dive below that to have a better sense, a country assessment. And we're doing this digital ecosystem country assessment, or DECA. We've done a number of them already in Kenya, Colombia, Nepal, Serbia, Pakistan, other places, and we've got a whole bunch more planned. That really helps us figure out where we can be most constructive and focus our resources to help partner countries really address their greatest needs. Some of it might be defensive and cyber, some of it might be strengthening independent media or around innovation. So there are lots of different directions that this can go in. So there's no one size cookie cutter, fits all by any means, because as you noted at the top, these environments are really, really different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm so glad you mentioned the digital ecosystem assessments. I mean, we just published a paper a couple weeks ago. It's on the Brookings website about how insufficient the indicators are around digital development. There's a lot of emphasis on, does someone have access to a digital financial services, but no sense as to whether or not those systems are designed with the user in mind and to uphold trust, and whether or not people are having good customer experiences with those systems. So there's a lot to do and to invest in so that we gain a deeper understanding and can do more of the kind of benchmarking around the way in which technology is progressing for good or for bad.
And I mean, this is a really important point. I think too often we have quantitative metrics, and we really have to have qualitative metrics too.
Right.
It's not enough just to say, oh, people are able to access this or that, but it's what is the user experience.
Right. Right. And I would say both are insufficient. The quantitative are not fully filled in either. So it's an area for much deeper investment, I would say, on global organizations like yours. So we're talking here about the complexity of all of these issues, and there's no clear answers or no kind of prescription we can copy and paste here. No country in the world has figured out how to promote innovative ecosystems that rely on data while also upholding data privacy. Nobody's really figured out how to promote free flow of content with that, while also curbing misinformation, disinformation. We struggle with these questions here in the US. Every country around the world is struggling with this. So how hard is it for you to make the case, either inside the Reagan building with your colleagues or on the Hill or the interagency, to make the case to invest deeply in digital development when the answers are so unclear?
Well, I think as we've been discussing, people certainly here in the Ronald Reagan building, but also on the Hill, they understand that the stakes are really high. We ignore this space at our peril. Our strategic adversaries are investing heavily in their own versions of digital ecosystems, and therefore I think that making sure that we are are focused on governance, because governance matters so much, and trying to set rules of the road that the democratic world collectively can get behind in terms of international standards and cross-border data flows, how digital public goods are developed and deployed, just to name a few. This was some items that we've made sure that G7 is looking at this year to really help reflect and solidify our democratic values within this ecosystem that we're talking about. Now, how you do it, of course, it is complicated, because one person's disinformation is another's freedom of speech, and it becomes quite complicated. But I don't think there's any lack of interest in this topic to make, and I think people have a good sense of how high the stakes are. And I think that our private sector companies have also become much more attuned to the issues that are at play. Not to say that there's consensus around how to deal with them, but really how connected so many of these issues are with respect to the digital ecosystem, how it's being used for liberal or illiberal purposes. So, this is, I think at a minimum, what USAID can do is be trying to build, invest in some of those, rules of the road, but also be building some resiliency in the partner countries that we work in, supporting civil society and academia efforts to identify and monitor how the digital ecosystem is being used in good ways and in bad. So that's part of the answer.
Yeah, and probably just, kind of creating the mechanisms for joint problem solving and peer exchange, just because these are thorny and fast evolving issues. We're seeing certainly a lot of demand just to connect with peers.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing I would say is that investing in digital skills in these countries, puts the more tools in their hands to figure out how they can navigate the digital technologies fully and safely, but really focusing on digital literacy, which is a big emphasis, and focusing on marginal groups, people with disabilities, marginalized communities, indigenous people, to really make sure that they're connected and that they're part of this discussion. And that they're not getting further left behind. So that's another big push for us.
Right. So a woman who held your job not too long ago, Bonnie Glick, reminds us often that USAID is 96% earmarked. Funding of USAID is 96% earmarked to sector issues such as health and education and agriculture. How does USAID structurally address this issue and match the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House that says these issues are so important?
Oh, you're hitting all the hard questions here.
I'm sorry.
No, not at all. I remember going through my confirmation hearing prep. I was like, wait, 96%? What am I doing here? No, I'm joking. But look, within earmarks, yes, you're absolutely right. There are sector earmarks, there are country earmarks. But within that, there's certainly lots of opportunity to bring different elements of our digital strategy to bear. You mentioned health. I mean, within the health world, we're doing so much in terms of a digital strategy, digital identity, that our entry point is in the health sphere. But making sure that as we help people access, emerging health systems in developing countries, that they're being built in such a way, and that digital identity is being built that it can be executed and used in a broader fashion for more of the digital ecosystem in the partner country, for example. So I think that there are lots of opportunities, even within earmarks, to do some very innovative work that really moves the ball forward.
Well, I know that it is possible to maneuver within the earmarks, but I, for one, certainly hope that there become more concrete plans in Congress to modernize foreign assistance to meet the digital age. I certainly found how, and felt firsthand how difficult it was to build up the skill set within the agency of people who really, really understood these complex issues and then could influence and support all the countries and the earmarked programs. It became a very difficult task, and I hope people on the Hill are listening for the need to modernize and address this issue, because it's very hard to take a cross-cutting issue like digital and try to fit into these earmarks.
Yeah, no, I recognize that challenge too, and I would say that we're seeing some movement, but you've touched upon a really important topic, which is making sure we have the skills within USAID to be very conversant and cutting edge on these topics. And we have to look internally too and make sure that we've got the right skills internally to be doing the cyber work that we want to be doing, the e-governance work we want to be doing, the countering disinformation and misinformation, and understanding AI in international development, and having the skills and capacity here to invest in and really build out digital public goods. I mean, that's ultimately, it has to be not siloed, but spread out across so much of the work we do, because so much of it is changing rapidly in response to opportunities that are now emerging because of the advances that have been made in digital. I mean, frankly, the work that Give Directly does could not have been done 15 years ago.
Right.
It's today, it's enabling a new type of work, a new type of model, and making sure that we, USAID, are fully, cognizant of those advances and driving them too.
Yeah, absolutely. I would be remiss if I didn't take a moment to acknowledge what an amazing digital team you have at the agency. Not only do you have some great engineers, but bioethicists and planetary physicists, and just an incredible group who are bringing systems thinking to these questions. And of course, working hand in glove with the democracy team to make sure that the governance around digital tools are governed in a way that promote democratic norms. So I really want to commend that team and commend you for keeping this issue on the radar. It would literally have been unheard of for the deputy administrator to spend 40 minutes talking about digital technology in my day at USAID. So it's wonderful to have you here.
Well, it is, as I said, it is such an important issue. It is critical to so many things that we're doing. And thank you for your shout out on the team. They are an amazing team doing so much amazing work. And I must say, I've been here for 4.5 months now. And every day I discover new capabilities that this agency has in all sorts of ways. And much of it is unexpected for me in when you get down to some of the really technical work we're doing here at the agency, be it on cybersecurity or in other respects, and it's making sure that work is well understood across the interagency too, so that we're really marrying up what we're doing here at USAID with broader strategic goals and objectives, so that you called out that great work in the democracy sphere. This does become such an important part of strengthening democracy. Stopping the backsliding on democracy is investing in strengthening this digital ecosystem. So thank you for calling that out.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, digitization is happening. We have to kind of do what we can to influence its trajectory, and doing nothing is, I think, just not an option. So Newsweek once described you as a woman who's shaking up the world. I didn't want to mention that when I introduced you because I didn't want to put the pressure on, but I'm certain the audience would agree with me that the label is well-deserved, and we certainly hope you continue to shake things up at the agency, particularly on this issue. You've been so generous with your time. Yeah.
Thank you, Priya. And again, I'm very sorry to be late. I'm sorry for our own digital challenges we had here. And thank you, Priya, for all the great work that you've done in this space. It's terrific.
Well, how about this? We will just plan to meet here again at another Brookings event. We would love to continue the conversation. I know USAID has a lot of things coming up, including what George Ingram mentioned earlier, work to unite many donors and democracies around a charter for digital public goods. So there's lots more we would love to talk to you about. And I would really hope we have a chance to talk soon.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And with that, I'm so pleased to now hand over the baton to my colleague, Landry Signier, who's a senior fellow at Brookings. Landry?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Priya. What a wonderful conversation. And looking forward to continue with those insights. Now, let me come back to our panel. So I am Landry Signier, and I am a senior fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program. And today I'm very excited to be discussing an extremely important topic with wonderful colleagues. So as you can see, we have a distinguished a panel on technology made on with distinguished women leaders. And as you know, disruptive innovation and the fourth industrial revolution, it is a core to my work. The fourth industrial revolution, broadly defined as the fusion of technology, blurring the frontier between the digital, the physical, and the technological world, has a major implication in the world in which we are living, whether we speak about productivity, sustainability, poverty, governance, security, among others. So what are the drivers of the fourth industrial revolution? What are its challenges, and what are the implications for Africa and for the global South? How can this fourth industrial revolution accelerate economic growth, especially inclusive economic transformation, quality job creation, especially for young people, for women, to generate a sustained development? This panel built on my forthcoming book, Africa's Fourth Industrial Revolution, with the Cambridge University Press. It will be released this fall. But also, and more importantly, on a Brookings report, which will be released this or next week, From Subsistence to Disruptive Innovation, Africa and the Fourth Industrial Revolution, co-author with my colleague, Louise Fox. And we bring those leading thinkers and practitioners to really understand the dynamics related to the fourth industrial revolution, to disruptive innovation, and how they are contributing to a more inclusive and equitable world. We have as panelists, Rosalind Doctor, Vice President, Technology and Science Policy, and Vice President, Middle East and Africa for IBM Government and Regulatory Affairs. We also have Stefani Falconi, co-founder of the Instituto Limited, and has also been working with the World Economic Forum. Louise Fox, co-author of the report, which will be released this or next week. Non-resident senior fellow here with us at the Global Economy and Development Program and the Africa Growth Initiative. And she has served recently as the chief economist for USAID. And finally, Lisa Witter, who is the co-founder and member of the board of Apolitical and the CEO as well of the Apolitical Foundation. Let me start with you, Luis, to share the insight from our paper. So as the world's youngest continent with a rapidly growing labor force, improving employment opportunities in Africa is particularly salient now and will remain even important given the number of young people expected to enter the job market. But of course, after a couple of decades of solid growth and improvements in employment opportunities, we have seen numerous challenges related to the COVID-19 global pandemic, and now increasingly with the Ukraine crisis. To what extent, Luis, could the new technology associated with the fourth industrial revolution accelerate the transformation of the continent by speeding up the creation of new wage jobs in as well as expanding higher productivity sector, leading probably to the decline in the share of people working in the informal sector? And to what extent could those dynamics will benefit young people? You are muted.
Okay. Thank you. And it's really a great pleasure to join this panel and speak with this group about our joint work and other work that's going on in this exciting area. I think most people know that the fourth industrial revolution, what makes us different is it's not just digital. It's kind of a fusion of the digital and the software with other scientific areas like biological or mechanical or physical, so that you really have a really broad range of innovation and development of new technology going on. Now, how is that going to affect Africa? And in particular, the journey that post-COVID Africa needs to undertake. Now, what post-COVID Africa needs to do is, of course, regain the trajectory of inclusive growth that they were on, before COVID hit. And that means they need to restart the economic transformation process, which was in the past 18 years, a process of balanced growth, which is why it delivered poverty reduction. Maybe not enough poverty reduction, but substantial poverty reduction by creating better employment opportunities. And so I think the question we are discussing with respect to Africa today is, could the fourth industrial revolution help accelerate that transformation? And if so, would new employment opportunities be supported, and would they be inclusive? And as you mentioned, given the fact that between 50 and 80% of Africa's employment is currently informal, this question is really important as applied to informality and the opportunities in both the formal and informal sector. So as you know, our analytical framework that we used is we looked at the economics of technology adoption, and we looked at whether this technology will be adopted by African producers. And what we know is it will be adopted if it's cost effective in solving current productivity problems. So a good example of that is, of course, mobile telephony and mobile money, which was not only adopted in Africa, but adapted and new innovation came from Africa and spread around the world. Now, what problems did it solve for producers of goods and services? Communication, information, cheaper financial services, better connection with the clients. And so it was both disruptive and inclusive in that way because it complemented labor. It did not just substitute for labor. So what can we say now about the fourth industrial revolution technology? And will it be like mobile money and be disruptive and inclusive? So just to summarize a long paper that we worked on together with a lot of analysis, we see the most opportunities in the service sector. Opportunities to expand formal services, the delivery of services in formal enterprises, because it really complements labor. It doesn't substitute for labor, and it could raise incomes in informal businesses. Now, manufacturing, there's been a lot of discussion about job killing robots. There probably won't be jobs killed, but it probably won't create a lot of new jobs in Africa, and it will raise competitive problems. Now, agriculture, there are many opportunities, and these have been widely discussed. But we see long-standing obstacles to technology adoption in agriculture, and these have to be solved first. And this has been shown by, for example, the low use of fertilizer, very old in agriculture, and these include tenure issues. % of have secure land tenure. These include weather risks, other price risks, and inadequate infrastructure. And finally, one major point is to be inclusive. African countries have to address all the skill deficiencies, including the skill deficiencies in the informal sector, and not just digital skills, but problem-solving skills, as well as some of the basic cognitive skills that really aren't being well taught in African schools today. So I'll stop now. I think I've said enough.
Fantastic. We'll come back to you, Luis. Stephanie, how are those trends? How will they compare to the dynamics in Latin America? We know that with your experiences with Ecuador, Brazil, and many other countries.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's such an honor to be here with I feel very junior here, but I'm so happy to be able to share some of the experiences here from the Global South and specifically South America, where I'm currently based. As Luis was speaking, I remember a visual that I saw not too long ago of how what % of jobs will robots take over. And if you look at the developing nations, in some places of Africa, it's something like 80% of jobs. And in some places like Germany, Europe, more developed countries, it's like 15 or something very small. And to me, it really makes sense because so much of what we do in Latin America, in some ways in Africa, are these manual jobs, and they're easy to automate. And so I want to zoom out for just a second and talk a little bit about what happens in resource-intensive economies, where so much to the central to the development agenda is talking about the presence of corruption and how resource economies are very ripe for lack of accountability. And so in my work specifically with environmental, I think we often don't have a real view of where our food comes from or what's happening in our forests, what's happening in the oceans, what's happening in the mines. It's easy to out of sight, out of mind, and without some transparency, traceability, and ultimately some form of enforcement, we have a real issue in trying to green the global supply chain, which is something that we've put in the agenda as important. How do we create supply chains that are more sustainable? And I think this is a place where the fourth industrial revolution technology can really give us a hand. It is a place where traceability and transparency can definitely become more tangible. We've seen that both through remote sensing, so we don't have to be on the ground to know what's happening in these forest areas, or even in the oceans, as well as genomics, blockchain for traceability, AI to be able, in big data, to be able to triangulate and also cross-reference where some of these products are going, and sort of what are those supply chains working. And I think it's really important to bring that kind of macro for our economies, especially if as we start hearing more about ESGs, environmental, social, and governance, and how that finance sector is going to affect this supply chains, and to ensure that we're not just greenwashing, but in fact, we are cognizant of where those products are coming from and how they're affecting those regions.
That is fantastic, and I really like the comparison, and this make me turn to Roslyn. How to make those disruptive technologies more inclusive? Do you have specific illustration? As we know, the technologies associated with the fourth industrial revolution are inclusive of artificial intelligence, blockchain, the Internet of Things, among other, cloud computing, among others. So how do we make those inclusive?
Thank you for that question. Thank you all for your contributions. And we say AI, right? Everyone, I think, has mentioned the word AI so far. I want you to know that IBM doesn't see AI as artificial intelligence. We see it as augmented intelligence. And that's where the human element comes in, that should serve humans to accelerate their own potential. And it needs to be inclusive. So I'm really glad you asked me that question, Landry. We're doing a program in Africa called Digital Nation Africa that's targeted at different levels and different experience levels of people in Africa, the youth, the entrepreneur, or the skilled worker, to augment their skills. If they know nothing about AI, take an AI 101 class. If they know more, they can take more advanced classes. The Digital Nation Africa platform, which is a pro bono cloud-based platform available to anyone in Africa, you can go to it. For those friends sitting in the United States trying to get there now, you can't get entry. You can also gives you cloud space to make your own AI applications, to try out cybersecurity. And it has a third component where it uses AI to do job matching. So if somebody wants to figure out what is hot, what should I study AI? Should I study cybersecurity? Stephanie mentioned blockchain. Is that the hot thing? Right? This, they can understand what people are asking for. There's some examples of somebody in Nigeria using Digital Nation Africa, where they've taken their badges and they post it, and they've become known as the IT man in the marketplace. And so people go to them to increase their skills and to learn how to use technology. That's one example. Others examples of people using Digital Nation Africa has increased their outlook of what potential jobs there are and what they should be studying and where they could be going. So that is one example of how we're trying to make AI inclusive, and so that everyone can take part, not only in using these tools, but developing these tools.
This is wonderful, because you mentioned the question of using the tools of building capacity among other, and this make me think about the work that you are doing, Lisa. So what are the most important skills and mindsets which are needed to really capitalize on the fourth industrial revolution through agile governance, for example, and can one really learn those skills?
Thanks for the question, and hi everyone that's watching. I can't help but be in a panel where anything around democracy is there, and not just say I'm sitting in Berlin and thinking about democracy and what's going on the footsteps. Berlin is we have refugees staying in our home. We have like the whole force of what's going on in the world is so present in our lives right now. And I just heard news that the mayor that was kidnapped by Russian forces was just somehow released. It seems like through a special operation, and he went back to work to being a mayor. So talk about agile governance. I can't even believe the amount of political agility we're seeing with leaders right now. So just to step back a bit and frame it in this democracy in this time where, you know, one big first principle thing I'm thinking about is, I think many of us on this call, whether you're young or old, we were all thinking about sort of a post-Cold War era that we were living in. And maybe we're still in that post-Cold War era, but it was a good reminder, I think, around democracy and governance and technology to always be questioning what our assumptions are, because sometimes they're not right. So just first principle thinking. So Landry, back to your question. So agile governance, Louise set us up very nicely, is really around what are those new phenomenons, and Rosalind was talking about this as well, that we're having to innovate around. And particularly, I'm the co-founder of something called Apolitical, global peer-to-peer learning platform. Priya, I heard you talk about people need to learn from one another. Global peer-to-peer learning platform for people in government, so public servants, to help learn from each other. Because as the fourth industrial revolution comes along, how do we do things like regulate or not for the shared economy, or for different platform plays, or for augmented, I like that, Rosalind, augmented the world and intelligence. And then as public servants, you know, what are the different methods that we need to explore that use technology and are more democratic in itself to advise governments on how to do that? You know, what can you do in the field? What do you need to do in the lab? And then what level of regulation do you need or not in order to have these new fourth industrial technologies, which, Louise, you're right, it's much more than just about the technology come to play. So what I thought I'd just sort of leave to answer your question is, we've done a lot of look at what are the skills and mindsets that are necessary. This morning I was having coffee in Berlin Mitte with someone from the Foreign Office in Germany, and I was asking him, like, what are the skills and mindsets you're seeing right now that you're needing in government? He's like, I really need time to stop and think, and that's the first skill set that we need. This time for reflection. Like, so much of what we do is we go, go, go. How do you stop during this time and reflect? What does this all mean, and what skills and mindsets do I even need? The second is to be data literate. So this call across the board, this is one of the #1 courses on Apolitical that we have, is how do I understand not just data and digitization, but digitalization, how it's changing the anthropology of how we think about how we do governance and do government. We need much more cooperation because the world is smaller now that we live in this technological age in some ways, much more. And we don't use this word in government, but I'm going to whisper it, experimentation. So I just say carefully try new things and share it with others. This adaptability, this deep need for curiosity, this need to be proactive, you know, not wait to react to what's going on, but proactive, which is related to this experimental point of view. And then very interestingly, across our 170 members and 170 countries, one of the #1 skills they say they need that they don't have as much of is it's a combination of effective communications with learning how to get buy-in within their government. So you can have all this great tech, you can have all these great dreams, but if you don't have the skills and mindsets individually and then collectively and then teams and then across your government, if we're talking about agile governance from a government perspective, it's not going to happen. You have to start with the people.
Absolutely. And Lisa, for the one who may not know in the audience what agile governance means, do you want to perhaps elaborate briefly on it?
Yeah, so I have a pleasure of, Rosalind and I are co-chairing, and Stephanie and Landry, you're part of this, the Agile Governance Council for the World Economic Forum. And what it just simply means is it comes from agile software development. So it's a fancy word. And by the way, when I talk to a lot of people in government, they don't like the word agile because it puts them on the defensive because it makes it sound like they haven't been doing this before. Government's been working in these ways for a very long time. It's just we're using the framing of technology because we're in the fourth industrial revolution. But what it just basically means is just flexible, adaptable, open to learning, open, curious, and fast. And I'll stop on the fast, Landry, because this is the tension I think we have with agile governance. There are new things coming onto the system very quickly. Governance, particularly in democratic systems, don't usually work quickly by design, right? They're meant to be consultative with people. And particularly if you have a role in government, you have multi-stakeholders and it takes time to get diverse points of views. So there's a real tension with agile governance in speed and the need for speed. And I don't think that's been figured out anywhere. And maybe later I can tell you some of the case studies of folks that are really outstanding leaders that apolitical and the council that many of us are part of are really spotlighting some outstanding individuals and work that government and businesses are doing together to make agile governance work.
Absolutely, this is really fantastic. And Rosalind, I see you wanted to step in, so please go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say that the term agile comes from the technology world that changed how they were developing software. So instead of one programmer working by him or herself to develop the application, they formed teams to quickly co-create. And even if the technology wasn't perfect, they would launch it, have others comment on it, and then adapt it and scale it. And it reminds me of a point that Luis made, that it's not just the technology skills that people need in Africa to be disruptive, but it's that type of teaming collaboration and what the tech world calls design thinking, right? Which gets to what Lisa was saying, how do you teach someone to be agile when we grew up all sitting in classroom and waiting till you're called on until you raise your hand? And if I can give one more example on what we're doing to disrupt education, is something that started in actually Brooklyn, New York, but now it's global. It's in Africa and Morocco and Egypt. We're hoping to open it in South Africa. It's a new private-public partnership with companies like IBM. We started this, but other companies are joining in, and secondary and post-secondary education. It's called PTech, Partners in Technology Early College High School. So it takes a student in post-secondary education, and it's random. There's no test to get into this post-secondary education. Any student can get in, and then it gives them their post-secondary degree, as well as a vocational technical degree, like an associate degree in cybersecurity. And not only does it teach those technical skills, but it also teaches those design thinking skills. And there's an example of a boy named Ahmed in Morocco who flunked out, couldn't stay in school because he just wasn't motivated and couldn't find his path. But he got into PTech, and he's now the top performer teaching others and will soon graduate.
Wonderful. And I see that everyone is very excited about the question. So Luis, please go ahead. You are muted.
There we are. I just want to build on what Rosalind said, because, if the fourth industrial revolution is going to be inclusive, the private sector has to step up and play a big role. And these examples of what IBM are doing are very important, because right now, African countries are spending about 5% of GDP or more on education. And of that, about 20% is going to post-secondary education. And there just isn't a lot more money. And so really these partnerships with the private sector to boost skills in various ways, in modular ways, as Roz was describing, are going to be super important in making the future of technology inclusive in Africa. And another issue we haven't really talked about is the cost of capital financing in Africa. And, one reason why I'm not too worried about jobs being destroyed in Africa by machines, by robots, is those robots cost a lot and they have to be financed. The US tax system subsidizes the cost of capital, and we've been in a low interest rate environment. And so that's why you've seen so much technology adoption here, substituting for labor, even when it doesn't actually have an absolute advantage. But I don't expect to see that in Africa. What I'm much more worried about in Africa is all this technology will be too expensive to be adopted. So I think we also need to think about new ways of financing. And again, the role of the private sector is going to be really important. Angel investors, private equity, all kinds of different ways of financing that we're so accustomed to now in the US, but which have only just come to Africa in the last 10 years.
Wonderful. And Rosalind, just before coming to you, I just want to remind our audience that they can send their questions to events@brookings.edu or on Twitter, hashtag Tech for Inclusive Growth. So events@brookings.edu or hashtag Tech for Inclusive Growth on Twitter. Rosalind.
To Luisa's comment about investment, technology can help too. You had mentioned agriculture, right? We all know that 60% of Africa is farmed by hand with no machine, and about 50% of the crops go wasted because they can't get to market. And we're working with a small company called Hello Tractor and John Deere, which is a big machine maker for the agriculture industry, to help predict crop growth, predict yield in order to get financing, right? And to explain to government how you can do incentive policies based on realistic projections. So there is a role, right? I completely support public-private partnership, but there's a role to technology also to help understand how we can invest better and more smartly.
I love the point, Rosin. Stephanie, and then I will follow up.
No, I actually wanted to come back to something that Lisa has shared, because I think sometimes in this conversation about the fourth industrial revolution, where we get so excited about smartphones and smart cities and smart appliances and smart infrastructure, and we get lost that it's still the same human behind all of that. And so how do we make augmented human capabilities to go along with this tech, this super tech that we have in our hands, and so that it is directed to the things that make, because the same technology that can make democracies work better is also the one that can spread misinformation, or the one that is creating all kinds of other havocs. And I want to come back to some of these skills that she talks about, because I think ultimately it's the people that we need to be thinking about. How do we skill ourselves and the workers, whether it's in the public sector, the private sector, or the education. And I really like this idea of data literacy, time for reflection. I feel like we are so inundated with data all the time, and somehow we've conflated that data means intelligence, that just because we have information, we somehow have actionable intelligence on what to do with it. And in my work, what ends up happening is there's a repository of databases that nobody knows what to do with it, or at least nobody that is in a decision-making capacity, because they have so many other tasks that they have to do, and they don't have the chance or the ability to go and do data scraping and then analyzing and cleaning, and I think that it is a role for, we have plenty of smart people that could do that, but I think we need more communication between whether it's the academics or the data scientists and the people that are making the decisions, or in the case of what Lisa is doing is, actually teaching some of those skills. And I just want to give a shout out, because I know that you guys have been working with the National Administration School here in Brazil, and some of the work that they are doing that is also phenomenal, and just bringing the capabilities so that we have smart devices in the hands of smart decision makers.
fantastic, Stephanie. I see this topic is very exciting one. So Lisa, please go ahead, and then I will come back to Luis with some questions on the challenges.
Maybe I'll bridge, Stephanie, from the skills learning and then back to the inclusivity piece that we started this with, which is in our research at Apolitical, when we asked public servants, because that's our world. So we're talking about the private sector and the public sector, and then there's civil society. Lots of people play a role in this, but we were particularly interested in how the public sector, which controls 40% of the GDP and is the largest workforce in the world. I know Rosalind was a former public servant. I've been a former public servant. I'm not sure who else on the call has been serving at different levels of government. And the last survey we did with them, this was a global survey, 95% said that they use non-work resources to upskill. And very few, like less than 60%, said that anything they had access to within their governments where it was helpful. So back, Rosalind, you're talking about a lot of the skilling we have now of people in public service is back to the classroom instead of these more dynamic methods. And I think COVID has really been a good shock to the system that way for governments, is that they've had to just learn how to do things differently, and that more agility has been built into the system. We don't know if it's net positive or negative. We're still, in the mix of that, but there's some really agile muscles that have been flexed around this that I think have been good. And now we need to make that agility, that risk-taking experimental time, we need to be reflective about it, Stephanie, and sit back and then say, what have we learned? On the inclusive, we run a big project along with the Gates Foundation around the Generation Equality Forum. So this was Beijing plus 25. This was the global commitment to how do we actually bring gender equality to the world. And we run cohorts of public servants. And one of the top things that they say in order to advance gender equality, which we need in Africa and Europe and all around the world, is they need gender disaggregated data. And so without the data literacy, we cannot have real inclusivity. And they don't have gender disaggregated data, let alone in many places intersectional gender disaggregated data. So that's really important. Maybe the last point I'll make on this is that we're talking about augmented intelligence and how this impacts democracy. To your point, Rosalind, that around how it needs to be augmented. One real fear I have in this space, there was early enthusiasm around technology. I remember the internet coming and it was going to be this fantastic place and everything was going to be fantastic. We had Web 2.0 and 1.0, and now we're in Web 3.0. And I think it's early to say what this means, because who's making money, what does this mean? But I do know that a research survey showed that more than 51% of Europeans thought that, even knowing the limitations of what other people call artificial intelligence, that artificial intelligence would be better at governance than politicians would be. And that just basically means that trust in institutions is low almost everywhere. And there's research that shows that if trust in government is low, trust in businesses will be low too, because of the effect of just not trusting institutions. So I think no matter what sector you're in, investing in rebuilding trust in institutions is going to be critical to protecting democracy and being inclusive. And you cannot do that without workforce development. You just can't. You have to really invest in people.
Wonderful, Lisa, and I really like how you connect the question, the democratic question, accountability, with the importance of inclusion among others. So to give back agency to citizens. Luis, in our paper, so we discussed about, and you highlighted them beautifully, many opportunities in various sectors, whether the service sector through e-commerce, expanded tourism, representing probably the greatest opportunity for formal wage employment using the fourth industrial revolution, or the agricultural sector also, which could increase farm earnings and a reduction of poverty, the manufacturing sector, which can open new opportunity for smaller scale production. So my question to you, what are the challenges that could the leaders and business, both policy and business leader could face in really unlocking the potential of the fourth industrial revolution, of disruptive innovation, in generating quality job and more equality and sustainable development. And what is the way forward?
Easy question, Landry. Easy question.
I'm muted.
But we did indeed identify three main buckets, shall we say, of challenges. One of them is indeed in this agile governance area and how to revise regulation. You know, a lot of African countries, when they emerged from colonization, they kind of adopted many of the legal codes that their colonial masters had in the 50s. And those are simply not adequate for today's world. So trying to figure out how to revise them and be more agile is a real challenge. Things like tariff policies. A lot of tariff policies still think of anything with a chip in it as a luxury. And that is really not true anymore, right? A mobile phone is just not a luxury anymore. So that's the first part. And we talked about that quite a bit, I think, already. Although I do love, Lisa, the idea that people prefer chatbots to politicians and bureaucrats. My goodness. Now, the second, though, are the gaps in physical and digital infrastructure. And we've really come to understand how important, for example, electricity, affordable, reliable electricity is, because otherwise, you know, you can't use all this digital infrastructure, right? But in addition, cost. There's a big difference in how much a mobile phone package costs, or even a low-cost internet package costs among countries. And you have countries like Kenya who've really figured out how to get it priced by the private sector in such a way that you get access. And also South Africa and other countries that have not managed to do that. They don't want competition. There are a lot of other reasons, but there has to be a lot of attention to that and to getting more available infrastructure internet in urban areas through how you spectrum, etc. Finally, the labor force of today's labor force, and of course of the government, as you mentioned so often, Lisa. And you know, if the government itself isn't using these technologies, they often don't understand them. The private sector can do what they can, and Roz, I know IBM works on this very intensively to try to work with government to understand what are the policy issues and how different options affect it. But this skill issue, I think, is really going to play a major role in that, and the pricing of this technology is going to play a major role in whether it's inclusive or not.
Fantastic. And so we know that agile governance is also trying to address many challenges, including the pacing challenge. And pacing may mean things should go faster or slower depending on the context or depending on the innovation. For example, in the context of the COVID-19, for vaccine production, what was the appropriate speed? Sometimes faster is not always ideal. So it's the appropriate speed may also mean sometimes slower to make the due diligence to ensure that the compliance. But we also have the coordination of a broad variety of actors, whether public, private, local, federal, international, or in various sectors as well. So Lisa, what are we not thinking about that we should be when it comes to preparing leadership for agility?
So I'm a co-founder of the company, but I'm now the CEO of our foundation, and the foundation's role is to really help build trust in politicians and public leaders, so the elected folks. And politicians, I think, are the least respected job in the world these days. It's different at different levels, right? Local politicians tend to have more respect than folks at the national level because trust sits in proximity, right? Mayors tend to be better liked others. And one of the things we run for the last 25 years, I've been a political entrepreneur and running political training institutes around the world that actually helped prepare politicians to be policymakers, which is why I think people go into politics or should go into politics. And we just did a mapping. We're about to put out the report of 400 political training organizations around the world. And basically none of them in any significant way are preparing politicians for the policy issues and even the technological questions that you see. I know one of the groups that is maybe watching right now, and I know was tweeting about this, was Tech Congress. So trying to really help Congress people or politicians around the world better understand these issues. And where I see hope in this is that we have a wave of young people. If you look at the continent of Africa, you have so many young people, but older politicians. Younger people they're digital natives, to say the least, right? For better or worse, they're born with a cell phone, maybe not in the moment in their hand, but quickly afterwards. And so they're understanding the anthropology of technology. So I think it's not enough just to say, how do we kind of retrofit older political leaders? There are some great political leaders who are being retrofitted and are really open to doing this. Lots of politicians, older politicians, are using TikTok and thinking about technology and regulation differently. But I also think we need to think about more inclusive people who get into politics, and really representative people. And we have a lot of work to do closing the gender gap. It will take 145 years to get equal representation between men and women. If you look at many groups across the world, there's underrepresentation of disabled people, of LGBTQ. So if we want to have representative, agile governance, we need representative political leaders and, frankly, public servants in that. So it's not just about the skills, it's about the who. We need to work on that as well.
Wonderful. And Rosalind, how do we use technology to better govern, to be more inclusive, democratic, and representative? So two dimensions probably. So how do we better regulate tech on one hand, but how do we also better use technology to better govern us, to govern us more democratically?
Sure, thank you. And I want to go back to what you said about agile, and like during COVID, we need to be, the pacing is different. I want to commend the African leaders in many, many countries that change what a critical infrastructure, the definition of that and their regulation, to include tech workers, because when they had curfews, the tech workers needed to get out to help the critical infrastructure providers, whether they be the telcos, oil and gas, or energy companies, to stay open, keep their lights on, and to do what we all needed to do so we could fight COVID. So we have seen examples of agility globally, including in Africa, right? And I think it's a time where you could pause and say, when should policy be proactive? And when is it okay to wait and see what happens, to be reactive, because you don't want to slam the door on innovation too soon? But to be inclusive, as you ask, Landry, I think there is a role for policymakers. And we heard this from the USAID leader, Isabel Coleman, in the session before this, around AI and emerging technologies. There should be explicit policies now that says that AI should not be used to exacerbate inequalities, for mass surveillance, for human rights abuses. There's a role for what we call precision regulation. You don't have to have all the answers and to thought through, because I agree, as what Luis said, that leaders need to know technology in order to set policy. Even in the US, we have that gap, right? I mean, that's a worldwide gap. But there's some things we can all agree on as common sense, or at least shared values. And we can put that into law now, that high risk AI, a technology that makes a decision without a human, which is not technology we do, but an AI that makes a decision without a human involved, that affects our livelihood, that affects our health, that affects our income, our job prospects, that should have an impact assessment before it's on the market. That should be tested for bias. So I do think there's ways to be proactive in a narrow way quickly, and then help create innovation and other places on AI, whether it's helping you learn how to paint or to create a new product, let that go forward.
Fantastic. Stephanie, we have discussed extensively many African trends, whether in terms of opportunity to address inequality, to create jobs. We mentioned the critical role of the cities. And I know that your work in South America has also focused on cities. So can you share some insight about how the fourth industrial revolution is transforming those opportunities, the challenges faced, and the way forward in comparison to Africa or to other regions around the world?
Yeah, no, I think that there's something to be said about South America. I'm based in Brazil, but I have visited other places, and I think we often forget that places here are a developing country, but with a developed inside. There's pockets here of highly developed areas. So Brazil has, makes Boeing 707s competing in the marketplace with Canada. Brazil makes, and I'm focusing on Brazil because that's my lived experience, but I know Chile, Argentina, some of the things that are coming out of these places are really great. And I think that the challenge is sometimes to bridge that gap, because some of the services that are available for the elite or for the middle upper class is not necessarily the services that are available for all. And I think that's where, making smarter policies comes in. But a great deal, I think, is being done in terms of identifying within cities, within logistics, within supply chains, just identifying what are some of the bottlenecks. So we talked about physical bottlenecks. Of course, there is, infrastructure issues, and you will see a huge that, in the state of Sao Paulo versus some of the Amazon states, what infrastructure is available, what kind of physical digital infrastructure is available is huge. But nonetheless, I think technology has been used in great ways to identify other types of bottlenecks, such as other capitals, so human capitals, financial capitals, resource capital, and how we move those across the logistic chains. And also, I think when we talk about agility, it's not just building stuff, not hard infrastructure, but also how do we upgrade it, how do we maintain it, how do we manage it, right? How do we find supplemental systems to the ones that are currently there? Because whether it's water or electricity, some of these infrastructure is already aging. So how do we make smarter infrastructure so that it's easy to manage, to go with the demands, with the growing cities, and I think all of that comes back to something I mentioned before, is how do we put the right data in the right hands at the right time, so that the information that we're gathering with IoT and the satellite data and all of that is actually being put in a manner, in a way that decision makers can make something of it. And I think that there are some great private sector that is doing that, but we want to make that sure that is also being translated to the public sector. And I have seen that there is quite a bit in skilling, the people that need to be, and there's a reverse also as well that I've seen, which is creating open calls for issues that cities are having, and then letting the startup ecosystem and the new ideas kind of flow in and see if they can meet those gaps. And so there's a lot in terms of, I think where there is needs, there's always somebody to solve it. And certainly Africa and South America are known for this kind of, we call it hacking, some call it agility, whatever you want to, I think we're really great at doing that.
Fantastic. And who are the leaders and who are the laggards when we speak about disruptive innovation and the fourth industrial revolution in South America, whether in terms of countries or in terms of cities? Stephanie?
I don't dare want to say. There's so much happening out there. I don't know. I mean, I know that there are hubs and they tend to attract a lot of people. I know, for example, I took part for some time as a teaching, startup about sustainability, the startup world. And I know that Chile got very well identified for this Chile startup. So they would fund you as long as you came there and you made things happen. I know that Sao Paulo is a great hub because there's so many headquarters here. And so Google came and had their campus here. But I do not dare want to say who are, I don't think I'm involved enough to say who are the leaders and the shakers. I think there's some really great people making things happen with big things happen with very little. And I really commend that. We don't have nearly as much capital as US and Europe, and yet you see great things coming out of South America.
Wonderful. Lisa?
Well, I just to help out Stephanie a little bit, one of the privileges that collectively many of us had was an open call process for Agile leaders. So these are Agile leaders within countries around the world. And one of the most exciting things at Apolitical Global Peer-to-Peer Learning is that often innovation comes from constraints. So some of the best ideas out there are from Africa and Latin America or India, these countries that just have more constraints. And what I find fascinating is we see reverse innovation happening where, some poverty reduction program in Kampala reverses, it goes, instead of from the north to south, the south to the north, up to the Bronx, because living in the Bronx is like living in certain. So I love this sort of reverse innovation and how we can all be sharing more to not reinvent the wheel. Just imagine how much money we could put towards it. But I'll just name a few people and just point people to this Agile 50 list. There was one that we did in 2020 and 2021. Stephanie has been really important to that, as have Landry and Roslyn in some way. So we have amazing innovators like the Director of Innovation, Bruna Santos at the National School of Public Administration in Brazil. A real thought leader, if you want to follow someone on Twitter in Latin America. I'm giving it for the Latin Americans here. Stephanie, as an honorary Latin American who happened to marry a German, I'm not sure how that happened. Carlos Santiso, he's a Colombian. He's the director of the governance practice for the digital innovation in government. So he knows all the best players in Latin America. And there are many more, but those are just two. But I really suggest you check out this Agile 50 because it not only talks about leaders, but it talks about also what they're doing. There's just great stuff happening in the UAE and South Africa. There's great things happening in Japan on sandboxes, which is a way to do regulation. Mexico, you have the founder of OS City and so on. So there are great people out there. We can learn from them and we can share best practices.
Thanks for the reminder. Yeah, the Agile governance is such a great list. And I agree. I think that the constraints that sometimes make, I was going to mention the work of OS City, Jesus Cepeda, who I met in person, but I think it's like reimagine what government could look like, because it's not just about digitalizing things, right? So we have everything in digital, but it junk in, junk out. If it wasn't working when it was paper, what makes us think that it will work when it's so? How do we make those flow, that flow of data work better and those communication, because sometimes many of these institutions were not made to communicate with each other smoothly. And so that's the next step, right? You digitize it and then digitalize it is the next step. How do you actually make that talk to each other? And that's the kind of work that they do. Thanks, Lisa.
Wonderful. This is really a very exciting panel. So before concluding, perhaps I will give a last round if you have like in 30 seconds, a final sentence that you want to make about the prospect of disruptive innovation and the fourth industrial revolution to really accelerate inclusive economic transformation, quality job creation, especially for young people and women and sustainable development? Like 30 seconds or a sentence. What is the key point you will be advising a policymaker in your respective region? Let's start with Rosalind.
Thank you. I would go back to precision regulation. Innovation and trust can coexist, but we must root out bias in AI, and then we can see the benefits of augmented intelligence through public-private partnerships.
Wonderful. Lisa.
Don't forget the why. A lot of times we get caught up in the what and the how in these conversations, and we have to say, why are we doing this? And not just in a defensive or reactive way, but what's the sort of world that we want to live in? Have we asked that question? And is the technology actually helping us, or are we being responsive to a product because it's in front of us? So keep the collective why, co-create it with citizens, and keep that as your real guiding force.
Fantastic. Stephanie.
I'm going to go back to something that Lisa said, that, you know, democracy is messy. And I just want to keep that in mind, because, you know, I caution against rushing to some clever solution that, you know, promises to clean up messy problems without actually thinking what's behind it. And I think what we need in this moment in time is, you know, how to make systemic improvements, and much of that stems in public policy. And so, you know, just kind of muddle through that difficulties, but technology can help us making more clear and transparent and open our institutions.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Lois.
I guess I would say to African policymakers, remember that over half your voters are working informally on farms or small non-farm businesses that they or their family run. And, you know, make sure that whatever policy you're making works for them. Make sure they have a safe place to work, a place to keep their equipment, etc. And that technology is accessible and affordable to them. And that's how you'll get economic growth, really. And that's how you'll get inclusive growth. So that would be my piece of advice.
On this wonderful note, I would like to express our deep gratitude to our distinguished panelists, Lisa, Rosalind, Stephanie, Luis, and also to our audience. I would also like, beside you, our distinguished speaker, to express our gratitude to the staff who has worked tirelessly here, Katie Portnoy and Adia Danatia, Esther Rosen, and Dan Lawrence. So thank you so much for making this event possible. And I will finish by acknowledge the leadership of John Allen, who has supported our work, as well as the Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative team, including Chris Mazurol, Sarah Reed, and Jessica Brandt. The event is closed. Thank you very much.
And thanks to you, Landry. Great job. Thanks a lot.
Landry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.